Logistics, we have lights up 3.
Hit push.
Push to talk. Because we're recording. Push, push. And then when lights up 3, that means the microphone's on. You want to talk and just push it.
Okay. That's good. You want to go find her?
She was
If there are any comment cards, I'll take them and from you, and you have a comment card. Bring it up to me. We are going to start
Shake it up.
I should.
Just give me a little juice.
right here, and if you want to check in with Mike. Huh? Yeah.
If there's a board meeting, there's a couple in your notes that are some I'm going to ask you about.
Yep.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
We're just about to start, everyone. So first of all, let me just say thank you very, very much for taking the time to be here today at 5:29. We're going to start at 5:30. We want to be respectful of your time. But we are deeply appreciative that you've taken the time to come out. It shows that you're obviously very concerned about what's going on in your community, in the counties, and everything else. So what we wanted to do is go ahead and get us going now. And if you could, we're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. So please stand. I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Buenas noches. El Distrito Escolar Unificado del Valle de Napa proporciona servicios de interpretación gratuitos en español para quien lo solicite. Tenemos 2 equipos aquí disponibles. Si saben de alguien, por favor, retíranos conmigo. Muchas gracias.
Okay, so it looks like we're going to be fine for electric capacity. We can start getting a little too full. We're going to have some overflow out to the auditorium down the hall, which has this live stream. And you'll hear as we walk through the agenda for today, you're having an ample opportunity to provide comment and that sort of stuff. So we'll get into that. But before we do, would you just stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I appreciate that. Mike right there. Mike, can you start us off?
Ready to begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. So let me, thank you. I wanted to take a special opportunity to thank our 7-Eleven committee. Again, if you haven't heard before, 7-Eleven committee is made up of no less than 7, no more than 11 people. It's a state mandate. It's a committee that the state, when school districts are really in public entity, starts looking at disposition of land in any form other than what its current use is, they want that district to go through a public process. And part of that process is they want to establish, as you'll hear later from our legal counsel, Betty Casey, raise your hand, Nathan, she'll walk through how do you propose a 7-Eleven committee to actually has to demographically reflect your community and have certain positions. So I just want to say thank you to our 7-Eleven committee. With that, I'm going to take the roll. Call if I can. First Andrew Jackson. Is that right? I see Wendy is not here. Jamie? Thank you very much. much like a jury would be, in case we have somebody that can't make it for any reason. And we are going to have a series of meetings where you can have some ample opportunity to participate and communicate. But for some reason, I'm on the 7-11 committee tonight, and it's going to have all the steps. So thank you very much. Very much appreciate your participation as well. All right, so we obviously have a quorum. We need to have a quorum. This is a public body. It's actually a committee. It's an advisory committee. What they ultimately do is not going to be necessarily binding on the district, but it is advisory. It is very, very important, and it is actually run. And I think it is why you'll find out some legal guidelines as to the topic, one of which is we have to have a quorum. Obviously, thank you. There's Wendy. Thank you for being here. Appreciate that. We have all 11. Thank you so much. Appreciate you being here. So obviously we have a forum, so we're located, commence now with the meeting. As a former city council member in the city of Fremont, we have a very similar process where we have an opportunity, what you're seeing up there is called oral communications. That's an opportunity for you to speak on something that's not going to be on the agenda today. I can tell you we're going to have an extensive agenda having to do with demographics and finance and facilities, which is going to be rather robust. So I don't anticipate that we have any one that would want to speak at all communications, but I'll just put that out there. Is there anything else that somebody wanted to speak to tonight?
So just for the record, I currently have collected the comment cards, and all comment cards are related to the school closure topic.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. Well, very good. We very much appreciate that. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like, if you do have comment cards and you're going to be speaking or think you're going to be speaking items that are going to be on the agenda, I'm going to walk through the agenda. Can you go ahead and put all this stuff on your agenda for a second? Walk through. Roxy and I have superintendent come up to come up and provide welcoming remarks. Before we get there, though, I want to just kind of walk you through the agenda so you know kind of what to anticipate and where you're going to have an opportunity to speak. So if you have speaker cards that you want to hand in, you'll know when that opportunity will arise. So the agenda is right before you, so what we're going to do, we introduce the committee members. I want to have an opportunity then to turn it over to Megan Macy. Actually, no, before I do that, I'd actually like the committee members to not just my introduction. Could you understand to introduce yourself and give us just a short background on yourself, where you work, and where you live, where you might, where you're interested in the community? That first might be helpful for the community just to get a little bit of a sense of yourself. So would you mind starting off?
My name is Andrew Dameron.
My name's Andrew Dameron. I have 2 kids at Mount George School. I am a civil engineer at Napa Sanitation District. Before that, I was, for 10 years, I was a development consultant. I'm a local youth soccer and baseball coach.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Wendy?
I'm Wendy Pisha, and I also have 2 kids. My children are at West Park. I was born and raised in Napa and went to West Park myself, and I'm the executive director of Napa Humane.
Thank you very much. Jamie?
My name is Jaime Magaña. I work for the Napa County. I have 2 kids. One graduated from Venice High School 2 years ago, and the other one is a junior this year. And I live on the west side of Napa County, of the Napa city.
Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it. Katie?
I'm Katie Garibaldi, and I am a teacher at Mount George, and as well as I have 2 students that my own children, and lots of other students.
Thank you, Katie. Barbara?
My name is Barbara Franco. I'm a retired educator in Napa Valley Unified School District. I participated on the creation of the new high school boundaries for Napa and Vintage High School when American Canyon High School opened. And so, though it's not the same situation, it definitely was a very emotional topic for people. And so I just bring that experience with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Eric?
Hello, my name is Eric Knight. I live in Yountville, and I work at the Home Depot in Napa here. I have 3 daughters that had graduated and went through Napa Valley Unified School District through Yountville Elementary, Redwood, and Vintage High School. And in the past, I served 2 terms on the Yountville Town Council.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Eric. Okay.
Hi, my name is Kay Vang. I'm the principal at Canyon Oaks Elementary School, which is the largest elementary school here in Napa Valley Unified. I've been in public education for over 20 years, and this is my third school district.
My name is Arvind Nishal. I live in American Canyon, and my kids went to Napa school districts, and my grandchildren go there also. And I have a UPS store in American Canyon serving the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. Laura?
Do I hold it when I talk? Okay. Hi, I'm Laura Miller, and I have two daughters that graduated from Napa Valley Language Academy and are currently attending Harvest Middle School and Vintage High School. I, too, am a graduate of formerly El Centro, Redwood, and Vintage, and I have lived in the community for my whole life, and I work as a mortgage banker here. And thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate it. Eric?
My name is Eric Housley. I have one child in the district. He's a junior, or he's a sophomore at Vintage. I am a graduate of Yountville School, as well as Redwood and Vintage. I run Napa United Soccer for about 1,800 kids in the valley, and I was been on the Yountville Chamber Board for 20 years, and then I have Ranch Market, Il Posto, multiple businesses in town.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Whitney?
My name is Whitney Ferris. I am a mother of two daughters that currently go to Alta Heights and a third that I hope will attend there someday. And I'm also a business owner in Napa. I own and operate 4D Ultrasound of Napa Valley. I'm a homeowner in Alta Heights School District, and I'm just happy to be a part of this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. If we give them a round of applause, I appreciate your time. We have a really tough time finding members. We had an outstanding turnout and a lot of interest, and so thank you very much. Appreciate that. So next, what we're going to do, I'm going to walk through this agenda real quick, and then I'm going to hand it off to Megan Macy. She's going to walk through the legal mandates and guidelines associated with being a member of the 7-Eleven committee, which is going to be very important for them to understand. As I said, these are actually public meetings, just like the city council and commission meetings. They're got to have the same sort of guidelines, and Megan is going to walk us through that. What is their role? What are the guidelines? What are they really meant to do? And ultimately, as I said, they're going to produce what is going to be a final advisory report, and then they are going to report out to the actual school board. So not only will you have multiple meetings with the 7-Eleven committee, but you have opportunities to speak to the board itself in the final advisory report. What you're going to be hearing today, beyond just the legal input, is a tremendous amount of information and background the staff has really been working on for really months. So they really worked extremely hard to try to condense it down to something that is understandable, but there is going to be a lot of information on the financial status of the district, the facility, the facilities themselves, and then enrollment trends, demographics, that sort of thing. So you have three different presenters, and as we go through this, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be stopping at appropriate times and checking in with you as well as, and we're going to check in with the committee. We're going to ask the committee if they have questions. We're going to be responding to their questions because they're going to be ultimately responsible for writing that report. At the end of all this, when we get down to the public comment part of it, that's when you're going to have the opportunity, and we're going to open it up to you to be able to ask questions and provide comment to the committee. And that's really who you're speaking to tonight, is the committee, on what some of your questions might be, clarifying questions. Hopefully we'll address a lot of those. Any concerns that you might have. What we would ask, and this is really meant to be, oh, sorry about that, again.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so sorry about that. So what we would ask, though, and this is in deference to all of you who obviously have taken the time to be out here, is if there are comments that start to become repetitive in nature, what we'd ask you to do is just kind of work amongst yourselves to have somebody come up and communicate that. But we're going to open it up at the end and provide you with ample opportunity. We're here to stay as long as you'd like to stay and hear your comments. So, and then at that point, we're going to then adjourn, and as you'll see, we have our next scheduled meeting for September 3rd. I'm sure you're seeing the updates on the district website, and as I said, we anticipate having at least 4 meetings. We'll see where the committee is in that regard and see what their thoughts and input are. Any questions about the agenda itself? Yes, ma'am.
So the information that you're going over was not included in a
Superintendent?
The materials will be made available on the district website, and not necessarily always in advance. So it just depends on, what topics emerge and what work district staff has to do between meetings, but they will always be provided and made available. This presentation will be made available shortly.
Is it all possible to have it in advance for data and such? Because it helps to formulate questions that we might bring, so just as a suggestion.
It's a great comment, and what we'll do, and again, that would be one of the types of questions that we would ask at the end, is that you'd say, hey, listen, in the future, can we get things in advance? And we'll make sure that we're evolving just like you. We want to be as transparent and open with the information as we can, so we'll do that. So we will hear your comments at the end, ask for you to provide us with comments exactly like that will help us improve our communication, but that's a fantastic question. Okay, so what I'd like to do now, if I could, is hand it off to Megan Macy, who is legal counsel for the district. She's going to walk through just the roles and responsibilities and the guidelines associated with the state mandates as it relates to 7-Eleven district advisory committees. So committee members, feel free to write down questions, and when she finishes, we'll look to you, see if you have any questions for Megan. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan. Thank you, Megan.
Hi, good evening. We're good? Okay, can everybody hear me? So I'm going to cover 5 important topics for all of you in as short order as possible. If you have questions, though, I'm happy to field them. And if there are follow-up questions that bubble to your mind after the meeting, I would direct them to the superintendent, and we can help out with any responses that you might need. The first topic is the Brown Act, and I know we have some experienced members who've served on other boards and councils, and so I apologize for any repetitive part on the Brown Act, but this is a Brown Act committee, and the Brown Act is California's open public meeting law. The school board, of course, conducts its meetings in accordance with the Brown Act, and its committees, like this one, that are a committee for a particular purpose, are also subject to the Brown Act. And so the purpose of the Brown Act is that you have transparency in your process, and it was a great question that was raised on the question of transparency, and that's exactly why we're working through the Brown Act process. What it contemplates in the committee setting is that you have an agenda that is noticed to the public, so the public's aware of your meetings, that you conduct your meetings in accordance with that agenda, and oh, sorry, are we getting?
I'm sorry, can somebody turn off their live stream? Thank you.
Thanks, sorry. And that the meetings themselves are conducted in a public setting such as this. One thing that I always like to think about in the context of the Brown Act is that these are meetings that are held in public. And so you're having your discussions in public, and when you ultimately are making your recommendations to the board, that has been conducted in public and in this setting, but it's not a meeting of the public per se. Of course, we have wonderful community members here who are here to also share their opinions, and so you can take that into consideration as you are doing your deliberations. So we talked a little bit about the notice requirement, the agenda requirement, and that was published on the district's website online, that the discussion takes place in the public setting, and then, of course, the public comment. In the committee setting, we follow the board bylaws in terms of the public comment component of this, but this is also a setting where it is important because of the nature of the work that you are doing, that the public comment is received and meaningfully considered. And so what the board bylaw says is that for items that are on the agenda, a member of the public has 3 minutes to speak, that for a particular agenda item, there is a 20-minute total for that, but there is discretion by the chair, and we'll get to that part at the end of this review. There's discretion by the chair to allow for additional public comment. And so it's a discretionary point and just something that I wanted to note for all of you as you are conducting your meeting. I want to raise kind of the biggest pitfall, because I don't want anyone to, inadvertently, when trying to do a good job, run into a concern under the Brown Act, and that is that because meetings are supposed to be conducted in public, we don't want to fall into a situation where we're having a serial meeting outside of this context. And what I mean by a serial meeting is more than a quorum of this committee talking to each other about the substance of the committee outside of this setting. And so it's really critical. That includes a meeting can be running into each other at a social event, but it can also be over email. And so it's really critical that you work with district staff in terms of the information flow and not communicating with each other outside of this setting, because we want to be completely in accordance with the Brown Act and transparent with the public. So that may be actually the quickest Brown Act overview that I have ever given. Usually it's like a 2-hour presentation, so if you want to be really bored by an attorney. But I did offer and give this as a gift today to all of you, which is the Lozano-Smith Brown Act handbook. So if you are looking for some bedtime reading, that would be a good option. It has everything that you need to know about the Brown Act, and happy to answer any follow-up questions that you might have there. So any immediate questions on the Brown Act before I move on to the other points? Okay. So the second important issue to kind of just keep in the back of your mind is that in this capacity, you also need to be cognizant of any potential conflicts of interest that you might have. It sounds like a lot of you are homeowners in the area. Certainly you have students attending schools. The conflicts of interest that are of concern in managing an issue like this are economic interests, and so you will be asked to fill out a statement of economic interest. It's called a Form 700, just to kind of disclose if you might have any specific economic interests that could relate to the schools that are being discussed. My understanding is that in the initial review process that was not a concern. So, but in full disclosure and transparency, the district will be requesting that. So, I guess turning to the substance of the role of this committee and kind of the important work that you all are doing, the fundamental role of the committee is to make a recommendation, an advisory recommendation to the board about these schools that are under consideration. And one thing that I want to note is that when you look in the education code and you read about the 7-Eleven committee, the focus is really on the disposition of surplus property, but that tool is used not just for that purpose, and your purpose is not primarily about that. Really, it is primarily about discussing the enrollment needs and questions of potential school closure and whether or not those schools should continue in operation. And so I want to, I guess, clearly make the point that the primary focus is not on disposition and what's down the road. It's really about kind of what the preliminary step is and the use of this committee in that process. Turning, and I'm going to, for the benefit of, everyone, just very clearly, and it's Education Code 17390. I'm just going to talk quickly about the tasks so you have them fresh in your mind as you start out on this journey. One is to review the projected school enrollment and other data provided by the district to determine the amount of surplus property and real property. And again, think about this within the context of whether or not the sites are going to ultimately be needed or not. Second, to establish a priority list of use of surplus space and real property that will be acceptable to the community. Third is to circulate throughout the attendance area a priority list of surplus space and real property and provide for hearings of community input to the community on acceptable uses of space and real property. And that is what the function of these meetings are. Next is to make a final determination of the limits of tolerance of use of space and real property and then forward that report to the board. And you're going to be provided with a lot of data and information by the district's team in doing that. And you should be, reaching out to them and making sure that you feel fully informed as you guys are working as a collective body. And then the final point I want to kind of touch on is the composition of this committee because it's very intentional by the legislature that it is a wide-reaching group, and you guys shared some of that in your kind of your personal stories, but just for the benefit of everyone. The Education Code 17389 requires that the membership of the committee reflect the following. And number one, ethnic, age group, and socioeconomic composition of the district. Number two, the business community, such as store owners, managers, or supervisors. Number three, landowners or renters, with preference given to representatives of neighborhood associations. 4, teachers. 5, administrators. 6, parents of students. And 7, persons with expertise in environmental impact, legal contracts, building codes, and land use and planning, including but not limited to knowledge of zoning and other land use restrictions of cities or counties in which surplus space and real property is located. And what the legislature had in mind by compiling all of these different categories, and it always feels a little bit like a puzzle when putting it together, is that if we can touch on all of those bases, which the board has in forming this committee, then we're going to get viewpoints from all parts of the community, and hopefully a recommendation that really is reflective of the community's values. So, any questions on your charge and your task ahead before we jump into election of the committee chair and vice chair? Okay. So, my task, before I introduce the superintendent, is to open it up to all of you for nominations of a committee chair.
Can you clarify what that entails, other than just being here to run the meeting and then foresee, is there always going to be staff even when we meet to come with the final determination?
So there will be staff to do, to provide feedback and input. The primary role of the committee chair is to run the meeting and make sure that things are being run in compliance with the Brown Act, make sure that the public comment is being received, and to just make sure that the meeting is in order. Do you have any additional thoughts on that?
I was just going to comment that really is my role, is to be there to support the chair and the vice chair. We know that you have other lives beyond just this committee. So of course I will be facilitating with staff, but effectively I'll be your point person. If you have questions during the week, or hey, listen, I need this bit of information, or not sure how I would operate or run the meeting in this regard, that would be my role, is to be that. I'm available 24/7, so you'd contact me. And so there's a nomination process here. There's also a self-nomination. If you say, hey, listen, I'm interested in that, because sometimes people, don't feel comfortable just saying, I'll do it, feel free to do that. But we do need a chair. We do need a vice chair. And they're both very, very important. Sometimes the chair can't make it. The vice chair will step in. So we do expect that you'd be there for the 4 meetings, and at least the meeting that we would be presenting the final advisory report to the board, all of which I will be working with you to put together. So I'll put it together. You'll make ultimate changes and final approvals of those. I wouldn't be doing that, but I would support you through that process. So hopefully it makes it a little easier to be the chair and vice chair. You're not thinking you're going to take it all on yourself. Did that answer your question, Eric? Thank you.
I'm willing to offer as chair or vice chair. I'm interested. I'd be willing to do it. I don't know if someone has a great passion to be chair, but anyway, I'm interested. I'm willing to step up.
I'm interested also in putting my name forward to be either the chairperson or the vice chair.
I'd put my name in as the vice chair, just as a backup option.
Okay, so as you're working through these types of discussions, this is our opportunity to practice. Does someone want to make a motion and a second for one of these folks who have graciously volunteered? And we are on the chair first.
I would make a motion that Barbara Franco be our chair.
I second it.
There's a second. Okay, so why don't we vote, and let's go around one by one. We have a motion and a second, so we need, if my math is right, 6 people to agree to that, and we can start with Mr. Dameron.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay. I think everybody voted? Okay, so the motion is passed. I believe it was unanimous, so congratulations. And now I will pass the baton to you, and you may call for your vice chair.
I have to go back and remember how to do this, but is there a motion on the floor to nominate a vice chair from the committee? Go ahead.
I nominate Eric Housley as the vice chair.
I second.
And can we go? If we could take a vote from the committee, and we'll start over here.
Aye.
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 You can vote for yourself. All right, any other questions before I introduce the superintendent?
I would just want to make sure that Eric and I have support from you to make sure that everything that we do meets the interests and the needs of the people in the audience, as well as the interests and the needs of the people here on the committee. So, thank you.
Absolutely, 24/7. Thank you so much.
All right.
So thank you, Megan. Thank you, Dominic. We appreciate you getting us off on a strong technical start because we know there's a lot of technicality around this process. But before we sort of dive into the content, tonight is really going to be focused, obviously, on laying out the foundation for the information dissemination that we need to do with the committee. You know, I just want to start with a very deep and heartfelt sense of gratitude. I want to personally thank the 11 committee members. Of course, now the additional thank you to Ms. Franco and to Mr. Housley for stepping up in leadership as chair and vice chair. And then I do also need to thank and recognize the 4 alternates who are here on the sidelines in case that we need someone to pinch hit if we're to use baseball terms. And I want to thank all of them because this is very, very challenging work. I, as just starting year 2 of my tenure here, you know, this is not a joyful topic. It's a very challenging topic. And it's challenging for me personally, professionally. It's challenging for the team. It's challenging for the organization internally. And of course, incredibly challenging to have this dialogue with the community. And so I just want to recognize that. These are complex issues, and their complexity, you know, it can feel emotional. You know, it's complicated. And so I just want to honor that and recognize it. And I also just want to turn to the right and to the folks behind me. We have principals of our small schools here. We have staff. We have teachers here from our small schools. We have staff from our other schools and district office staff all here. And then, of course, parents and interested community members. And I also want to thank you because I think what's been incredibly exciting for me in the 14 months that I've been here is that the Napa Valley Unified School District community has demonstrated to me that they have a high degree of interest, engagement, and investment in their schools. And as a superintendent of schools, you can't take that for granted. That is not the norm absolutely everywhere. And so as we navigate complex issues, as we look at our current reality, it's important for us to understand that our community is going to come along the way with us to understand the information, to ask critical questions, and we invite that and we welcome that because no matter how challenging what the scrutiny can feel or the critique can feel as we navigate a complex set of circumstances, the bottom line is those questions, the presence of the individuals here behind me tonight demonstrate that our community cares about our schools and our kids. And we're here because of our kids. And so for that, I also want to express my deep sense of gratitude. I do not take it for granted that I am serving in a organization, in a school district, and in a community where there's this degree of engagement. So thank you. I feel honored and blessed by the opportunity. I just, want to just make a couple comments, because really tonight we want to dedicate as much time to diving deep into the pertinent information we're going to share with you. We've been working rigorously up until today. I know that people think, oh, the district should just have all this information available at the tip of their fingers. There's a lot of hard work that goes into a critical, thorough analysis of information. And all too often, school districts don't engage in that preliminary work. It's our job to signal from a big picture standpoint, hey, we have a problem. We have to put the problem on the table. We have to surface that problem with some, high level information that we have. And then we have to start doing the drill down. And me and my team have been engaging in that drill down for weeks. We've been working tirelessly. This is not something I take lightly. I take process very, very seriously, and I have high expectations for my team as they also facilitate the knowledge building for the committee and for the community as we face these tough issues. So I would ask that everyone be in a listening and learning stance, that we listen and learn to the data that's been gathered, the information that's been gathered, that we're very open to listening and learning as the team presents financial data, enrollment, past historical trends, current and future enrollment projections, our facilities capacity, and the big picture around this work. And that we also listen to our community, that our committee also be in a very comparable stance around listening and learning. As information gets shared, our community is going to react to that information. They're going to have a lot of critical questions. Unfortunately, we're bound by the Brown Act, so it can't be a back and forth between community and the committee. Welcome to the world of Board of Education and Brown Act and how things work. But we do want to listen. We want to listen to the comments. We want to listen to the concerns in the community. And so I think it's important for those who visit us as guests at the meeting, but then of course us as staff and community and committee participants, that we really, really take listening and learning seriously. And that, we understand that we are really facing a very tough budget reality. And there's no joy as a new superintendent to have to be facing these conditions. It's a lot easier to be in an alternate reality. It's a lot easier to be in a growing district reality, a revenue generation reality, and that's not quite the reality that we walked into, or that I walked into in the course of the last year or plus year. But I embrace the challenge, and I'm confident that we will find the appropriate solutions to address the reality that we're currently facing. So thank you. The NVUSD community in these 14 months has demonstrated to me that they are so professional. They're highly engaged. They've been incredibly respectful as I navigate complex issues. And even in times where we've agreed to disagree, this community has demonstrated me a high degree of respect. And I really appreciate that. And I continue to be excited. Despite the hard work, I continue to be excited that I get to do that work in this context. So thank you to the community, the alternates, for being willing to do that work with us, alongside us, so that we can make the best decision possible for the approximately, we're hovering slightly below 17,000 students that we currently serve in the Napa Valley Unified School District. So let's get to work.
And I'm going to go over here so you can hear me. I'm so glad that she used the term challenge, because believe it or not, as I work throughout the state of California with school districts going through this exact same challenge, it actually becomes a fantastic community building opportunity for the community to work hand in hand with the district. So with that, we have our chief business official, that's Rob, right over here. Rob's going to come up and walk us through the financial data associated with the district, and then we're going to hand it off, I believe, to our demographer, and then to Mike Pearson on facilities. So let's start with Rob. Rob, thanks so much.
My eyes are starting to get worn out. I'm not quite sure if I'll need them. I may have to put them on midway through. I'm not quite sure yet. So again, my name is Rob Mangwala. I'm the new chief business official for the Napa Valley Unified School District. And so what I'm here to talk to you about tonight is I'm here to talk to you about verifiable data in terms of our finances and budget, and especially when we talk about enrollment data, part of the drive that you heard Dr. Mercedes talk about is how do we make our data transparent? How do we make sure that whatever data that we put in front of you will be data that you can find online on the CDE website? And so that has been something that we've really focused on. So the data that I put up here tonight, I will demonstrate how you can find the data online and look for it, and this PowerPoint will be made available up until the end. And like she called out, we were adjusting it literally to the end to make sure that you could see the slides, little things that you think about in your office, like, wow, this percentage look great, but then when you take the time to actually put it up on a slide, nobody can read it. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So with that said, I'll jump in. And so in terms of the agenda, I'm going to give you a budget update. I'm going to talk about a letter that we did receive from the county. I do have a copy of that, and we will put that up on the website. So the letter from the county outlined some significant and substantial budget cuts. This is a letter we got from the county back in April. I'm going to review some verifiable enrollment data from the California Department of Education. I'm going to talk about the basics of a demographer model. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I will be passing that off to our demographer, Rob Murray. At that point, we'll switch, and then I think, Dominic, you said that at that point, maybe we'll decide if we need to take some questions from the panel. So in terms of basics for a school budget, there's some certain things that you need to look at. When you look at a school budget, you see lots of numbers and lines and codes, and it can be quite confusing, but the basics boil down to a couple big factors. You need to look for enrollment trends. So that's probably the most important thing. Again, in a district like Napa Valley Unified, the revenue that we generate is based on the enrollment that we have in our schools. And now this does not include charter students. So we do not get any money for students from charters. And when you look at the data that I have in front of you, it will exclude charter students. Are we deficit spending? So are we spending more than we receive in revenues? Reserves. So there's a state minimum that we have a 3% reserve, but if you look at our board policy, our board policy actually says 7.5%, and so we've been below that for some time. It does cause issues for school districts. When you hover around 3%, you actually have to borrow money to make your payroll payment. So it is problematic to be down by 3%, and so I can get into the details a little bit later. So you need to also look for unsustainable programs like class sizes that are potentially too small at secondary. And then you also need to look at small schools. And then you need to look at future cuts. Do you need to make cuts going out into the future? So these are the 5 big things that you need to look at when you're examining a school budget. I'll put my glasses on. Hopefully you can see the numbers. I tried to make them really big. So if you can't, so this shows our reserves. And so what this slide shows in this bar graph, it shows the history of our reserves going back to 2014. And so in 2014, our reserves were sitting at about 8%. And again, what's a reserve, you might ask? It's like your savings account. So if you think about the savings account that you have, just household finance, what does that look like? Well, if you save money, you build a savings account. If you spend more than what you bring in, you dip into your savings account. That's just the basics of a reserve. And so again, you can see over time our reserve has dropped substantially. We're below our board required 7.5%. And we're right down there at the state required minimum. And so even to make this, one thing I want to point out, we have already made $7 million in cuts to get to this point. So our budget outlook, what this is right here, this is something that's unique to school districts. So school districts are required to prepare a budget for 3 out years. That's one of the things that makes school districts sustainable. So essentially what they do is they look at everything they know at the time, and they try and make a projection based on what they think is going to happen in the future. So there is some projection that things change, but based on the most current data that we have, again, we made $7 million in cuts already. We need to make $1.6 million in additional cuts in 2020, 2021. And the big one is in 2021, 2022, we need to make an additional $5.6 million in cuts. And so to just kind of put that in perspective so we understand the numbers, that this isn't something we solve by selling cookies, we're talking about approximately 56 teachers, just to put it into perspective. So they are big numbers. So at this point, what I wanted to do to just kind of put these numbers in perspective, I wanted to talk about an outside organization that some of you may know of, you may not. It's called the Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team. And so this is an organization that helps keep school districts on track. And so they will come into a school district when the county mandates it, like if a district can't make the cuts that they need to make, Or sometimes you can call FCMAT on yourself to have them come in and examine programs. So it's not uncommon, for example, for a school district to call FCMAT to say, hey, by the way, we have this special ed program, we're spending way more than we receive in reserves, or we have this food services program, we're spending way more than what it generates. Can you come in and take a look at it for us and help us kind of figure out what's going on? And then when they're done, what they do is they'll write a report. And so what I did is I have an example. This is not for our school district. This is not, because FCMAT has not come in and evaluated our finances, because it's a bad thing to have them in generally, especially the overall picture. And so this is a district in the East Bay. I have the name for privacy. I did kind of blew it out. If somebody wants to ask me, or you can probably find it online. And so if you look at this district, I wanted to just kind of point some things out and say, well, what do we have in common with them? So what has Napa Valley been doing that this district that has gone through bankruptcy in the past, what do we have in common with them? Because we actually, it turns out, now obviously the demography is very different, but if you look at the financials, we have a lot in common with them. And so there are definitely signs of fiscal distress in our district. It is very clear. In this summer, you can see there were refusals to consolidate small schools, which needed to happen. There were deficit spending, substantial reductions in fund balance, inadequate reserve levels, a large increase in contributions to restricted programs, in our case would be food services, and lack of oversight and position control. And what that nuance is when somebody's hired, you need to make sure that there's a budget for it, right? That's just the simplicity of what a position control is. A new teacher is hired. Before they get hired, we need to make sure that there's a budget for that instead of offering a position without having the budget in place. And so what this is, again, this is a letter that I will make available online again. And so what I'm trying to show you, this isn't us behind closed doors trying to hide anything about our budget. Again, these are verifiable facts. So the county gave us a letter back in April, and in that letter, they outlined some very substantial things that needs to happen in the Napa Valley Unified School District to keep us afloat. And so some of those things are that I've kind of highlighted from the letter, and again, the letter will be available tonight online. Both NVUSD and the Napa County Office of Education recognize the need to make very substantial budget cuts in order for NVUSD to maintain fiscal solvency. And then here's some direct quotes. To maintain fiscal solvency, the district must follow through with the proposed reductions and make additional cuts in excess of $1.6 million in 2020, 2021. The third bullet down. Currently, the district subsidizes its charter schools by not collecting full costs for facilities and overhead provided. Right-sizing the district office. Here's some other things. And this is what directly applies to this committee. So there are several small schools with low enrollment, including one with only 112 students. Maintaining small schools is inefficient and expensive. And so what you'll see from this budget thing, what you've heard from Dr. Musetti in the past, we're not just talking about small schools. What we're talking about is we're talking about the holistic things that we need to address as a school district in order to maintain fiscal solvency. And so with this slide right here in terms of budget, so we've had a lot of questions like, well, what does it cost to operate our schools? And there's a lot of like, well, what do you mean, what does it cost, right? Because there's a lot of different ways to look at it. You could look at their overall budget, for example. When you look at their overall budget, you can say, well, what's the cost of the teachers? What's the cost of the different things? And again, you don't need to take pictures. I will absolutely make this available online for you. There's different things that go into it, and what we tried to do with this calculation, and again, we're trying to be very conservative with this calculation. What we essentially said is, well, what are the costs that are associated with a school that don't follow a student? Because if you take, for example, if you take 200 students and you move them to another school, there's still going to be, some of those costs are still going to be there, right? You still have to pay for a teacher, right? You still have to pay for some of the supplies, but some of the other things you don't have to pay for. Like, for example, you wouldn't have to pay for the principal. And so what we did for that line, we actually, my budget department, they pulled up the principal's actual salary and their benefits. And you'll see that as we go through the slides, you'll see that every principal line has a different number. They pulled this from payroll. So just to like, where did it come from? Did it come from your budget? This is actually what we paid them. Clerical cost, cafeteria support, and custodial. So let me address those two items, because I know right now you're like, wow, $320,000 for custodial and maintenance? That makes no sense to me. How can that possibly be? And so that's probably the biggest one that you're all looking at. And I can see lots of heads nodding. That's the one that I looked at first too, that I questioned, like, how does that make sense? And so if you think about a school and you think about maintenance of a school, what happens? So let's just say this year, for example, at Alta Vista, you had a leak in the Alta Heights, and you had a leak in the roof, and you needed a new roof. Would it be fair for us to put in that in the budget that it cost $1 million last year? No, it wouldn't be fair. So you have to put that over time. So essentially what we've done with this number, and we did have a CPA do this, and we use outside consultant and a CPA to actually do this, we looked at our total cost for custodial and maintenance across the school district. We divided it by the total square footage across the district, and from that number, we looked at every single schools that we're questioning tonight. We looked at their actual square footage and applied that number to it. So that's the calculation we use, and we do stand behind that number. And then there's some other things there. Utilities, again, this is actual number for utilities for the building. Internet, and then the phone, I don't know, it's probably a low number. I just put to be determined. Mount George, so I'm not going to go into the details. Again, I'll blast through this a little bit, but again, because I explained the methodology, but again, this is available online. No need for a picture. I will glad this is going to be available. So $407,000 for Mount George. And again, you do see a difference in the principal. So again, I want to point that out. Notice that the principal is less expensive. There's a newer principal there, right? So you'll see that number, again, just comparing the numbers to show the accuracy of the work and the hard work that we've been putting into to try and make sure that we customize this for each individual site. You can see the difference in principal costs. West Park.
Just a quick question, I'm sorry. Are the principals full-time at all?
I'm actually going to get to that one. Yeah, let me address that on the next one. Yeah, exactly. It's a really good point. So we did address that. And then Yountville, and so there's a footnote, and so we kind of went back and forth about that internally about like, how do we charge off Yountville? Yountville, for example, if you look at Yountville in particular, they do have other duties for the district. So you could pull out, we can debate it. You could maybe pull out part of their salary, but the reality is they do spend 100% of their time at the site. They don't leave the site, and so they do other duties as a part of their job description. That's not true. That's not true. I'm sorry, can we keep that comment? Yeah. So at the end, when we have questions, for sure we can address that. So if there's a discrepancy there, I'd definitely like to hear that at the end. So again, so we could even if we were to pull out half, so let's just use that as an example. If you were to pull out half of their salary and make it $80,000, you're still looking at a number around $450,000 for Yountville, which is in comparison to Mount George at 407. So again, you could take out half the salary and it doesn't matter. So obviously, if you look at custodial and maintenance, the square footage, you could infer there that the square footage for Yountville is larger. So some of the budget highlights that I'd like to call out. Again, we spent more money than we received in revenues for a number of years. We paid for this deficit spending by spending down our savings account or reserve. Our reserve is depleted and down to just above the legal minimum level. We cut $7 million in 2019-20. We need to cut $1.6 million in 2020, 2021, and $5.6 million in, yeah, I already said that, so next part. So at this point, so now that I'm done with the budget piece, I'm going to jump into enrollment data. And so this piece, again, I encourage all of you to please go online and look at it and double check my numbers. I've had everyone I know double check it. I've sent it to consultants. I've had people in my own office look at it. Again, this is data that you can find online. And so the website that I'm using is called DataQuest. And then when you look at DataQuest, the name of the report that I'm looking at is I'm looking at District Enrollment Multi-Year Summary by Grade. And from that, this is the report you get. And so something, again, that's really important. It's hard to see that, but you'll see that. Yeah, I couldn't fix that. I tried. But I didn't want to make something. I just wanted to show you what you get. So when you look at this slide there, you can see, if you look to the far right and you squint really hard, I did exclude non-charter, because again, only non-charter students, because again, charter students do not generate average daily attendance for the school district. So it's super, super important to notice that. And then when I looked at how to look at the data, I chose to look at it by numbers. And then literally what you do is you just copy paste it. So if you just highlight it, copy, and then you go into Excel, you can paste it. So you do, it's called paste special, which is values. And then you put it inside of an Excel spreadsheet. And from there, I made something that you guys wouldn't have to squint at. So hopefully you'll enjoy my artistic talent in terms of making graphs. And so what this is this is district enrollment. So, and again, so this number, again, it does not include charter schools. So let me be really clear. It's just students that generate average daily attendance. And so you can see total district enrollment declined by 752 students over 5 years. If you look at elementary enrollment has declined by 688 students. Secondary enrollment has decreased by a little bit less, by 64 students, because we do have some inter-district transfers coming in, a lot more at the secondary level, so it kind of levels that off, especially in American Canyon. If you look at this piece, our demographer, Rob Murray, will talk about this. This is a really important graph. And so in terms of like looking at demography and like how do you predict future enrollment? Like what goes into it? Like I don't really know what goes into it. There's a couple really big indicators. So at kinder, it's pretty simple. Like a demographer doesn't look out 10 years. We don't use that. They say, okay, how many kids were born one year? Based on the number of kids who are born in a given year, they can predict the number of kids that show up in a school. And it's a pretty simple number. And so they can go back and they can look at the data and come up with a very accurate calculation they would say, okay, if 200 students, or 200 kids at that point, they're not students yet, 200 potential students were born in this zip code area where the mother resides, they're going to show up in one of our schools, give or take. And they're able to look at that over time and then make predictions. And so that's what happens when they land. That's the first step. That's what lands in kinder. But the part that's even more verifiable, which is the part that worries us sitting from a financial standpoint and from an enrollment standpoint, is if you look at kinder drop. And so kinder has dropped significantly over time. And if you look at that drop, remember that kinder, if you want to know what your first grade class is, you look at your kinder class. And then one thing to kind of point out there where you say, well, Rob, what's going on? Kinder is actually bigger than first grade. The kinder numbers, the way the CDE does the numbers, it includes TK too. So to just kind of toss that out there. So that number also includes our transitional kindergarten students. So it's important to recognize the big thing to see is if you look down, I can't quite read it from here, it looks like 1381 for a kinder in 2014-15, and then it's declined to 1191. So basically what that means is that cohort will continue to go through the system. If you were to take an example that doesn't really apply here, but it's really simple, if you were to say, okay, well, what's happening in a middle school? Like, I want to know what my enrollment's going to be like in a middle school. It's really simple. You just get rid of the 8th grade class and you add in the 5th grade class. And then if you take that back over time, you can look at that yourself and do your own analysis, your own cohort analysis. There's different changes to that, and some of those changes might be they use terms like cohort survival. Basically what that means is when a kid enters the system, how likely are they to graduate from your system? And so Rob Murray will talk about that also. So when we talk about our small schools, this is a reminder of the small schools. So Yountville, Mount George, Alta Heights, West Park. So if you look at this enrollment graph, and so what this graph shows here, you can see, again, the numbers are a little bit smaller than I anticipated on this. The average elementary, and this is sorted small to big, the average elementary enrollment is 402 students across the district. So that's the average. And you can see right now that there's some schools that fall below that. The low is 119. And again, the high in the district, it looks like, is about 682. So again, this is pretty close to where I transitioned to Rob. And again, this kind of goes back to what I chatted about a little bit earlier in terms of demographics. Births go into it, certified enrollment. So again, the enrollment that I'm talking about, this is certified enrollment. It starts in our student information system. It gets uploaded between October and December. So you may have heard the term CalPADS Day. If you're a teacher in the room, your principal will remind you, hey, you need to make sure and get all your drops done. You need to make sure and do attendance. It's an important day. It's usually that first Wednesday in October. And then that data gets certified through a process by like December. It gets submitted to CDE, and that's where we get our verified data. This is just a draft of the enrollment projections. So again, over 7 years, we're looking at a decline of about 1,465 students. And again, Rob will go over that. And that's it. At that point, I think I want to transition. Dominic, would you like to come up?
Open up for questions.
Yeah, sure. I'll have Dominic come up and facilitate that.
So what we're going to do here, and again, just so you, thank you, Rob, that was fantastic. So just so you understand how the state, the reason why the state has mandated this process is that we have an opportunity to, this is not the only meeting we're going to have, but we're having an opportunity to stop here, because as you saw, that's a pretty significant amount of data. We want to now turn it over, because I'm sure there's questions that you have in your head that you have. We want to have the opportunity first to have the committee have an opportunity to ask questions. We're going to get all those responses. If we miss something, please write it down. If you have not already put a card in, hand us in a card. We'll make sure that at the very end when you come up, because what we're hoping is through this process of what will be 3 different presentations, Rob has already noted we're going to have the demographer come up and talk about future trends, and then Mike on facilities. If we do not cover something, either 1, through the presentation, or 2, through answering questions that the committee is now going to be asking Rob, and if there's questions that we can't answer right now, we're going to write them down. We have somebody taking minutes over here, so we're going to write those down, and we're simply going to say, we'll get that to you at the next meeting. So if through the preponderance of all that, we still miss something at the very end when we're all done with all the presentations and you come up to comment, you will fill in all the holes, the things that we may have missed, or maybe we just didn't explain well enough. And again, we will either answer the question, or we will tell you we don't have an answer, and we'll come back to you at the next meeting, which will be September 3rd, with those answers, or we'll post them online, or both. Okay, does that sound fair? Okay, I think that's a way that they've designed it so it's efficient and it's effective. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Rob, and I'm going to hand it to the committee, and I'm going to hand it to the chair, Barbara Franco. If you could lead us through any questions the committee might have, we'd appreciate that.
Sure, happy to do
Thank
that.
you,
Dom. We'll take any questions from the committee for Rod. Yes, go ahead.
My question is for Rob. So just out of curiosity, you mentioned some statistics about a failing district. In your research, particularly on average elementary school size of students, did you run across what the average enrollment was for maybe a successful school district that was similar in size to the Napa community? I'm just curious if that was something that came up.
Well, in terms of being right now, what we're talking about successful, like financially viable.
Fiscally viable, yes.
I don't, there's not an exact number for that. Obviously, there's different variables. There's teacher pay, there's facility costs, and so forth. But what we do now, right now, is that small schools are unsustainable. So the exact cutoff for that, I mean, there's definitely debate. I can certainly put that down as a to follow up to see if there's a recommendation from a body like FICMAT or something like that in terms of an actual number. But local things vary. It varies based on local things. Again, if you take something where, if you were to look at a small school, for example, a single small school, I like to use my aunt's school as an example. So she taught in a small school for a long time, her entire career at Clear Creek. And so I asked her, and it was a school of a similar size, how do you pull that off? And she goes, well, remember, Rob, when I was at the end of my career, you were making more money than me the first year you started. And so those are the things that you come into play with a small school, is you're still paying the full teacher salary. Whether you're working at a small school or you're working at a large school, you're still paying that. Some of the other things that they did is again, principal salary is lower. All of those things are much smaller. Usually you'll find that in a rural community. So again, I don't know an exact example, but I just wanted to frame it with that. I don't know if you can write that down as a follow-up.
Any other questions? I have some questions, but I'll wait. Okay, Eric, go ahead.
I have a couple of them. Number one, where does our revenue streams come from? Does it 100% come from state and sources based on enrollment? Just so or are we going to get that data?
That, yeah.
Because we're going to get, I mean, we're going to need all this data when we try to put some of this together, right?
Yeah, so our funding, we get a combination of money. So we get our money through the LCF, the local control funding formula. And so we are not a basic aid district, for example, like St. Helena. So if you look at a basic aid district, what their revenues are purely based on property taxes. So their property taxes are so high that they generate that it just comes from that. They basically don't get money from the state. If you look at our model, there's a funding formula that's the majority of our funds. And so when we talk about funds, we talk about the general fund. And so if you look it up online, on DataQuest, you can also find our funding sources. And you'll see a line that says LCFF funding. And so that's basically based on enrollment. There's some other factors when you get up above 55% free and reduced lunch, where you get some additional money, but the basics is you get it generated based on the number of students. That source, the whole bucket that we get, some of that is property taxes, Some of that is you're going to get from the state. So it's a combination of the two. If at some point in time in the future, let's say our enrollment dropped 50%, I'm just calling out a random number, right? And our tax base went up really high, we could maybe be a basic aid district, but that we're very, very far away from that. I don't anticipate that happening in my lifetime.
I have another one. Seeing the drop, I mean, obviously lots of rumors have swung around for years. Seeing the drop in 2014 from 8% to nearly 4% in 1 year's time, that's a huge number. Are we going to at some point get the data of what happened for those? Was it just malspending? Like, well, what was the deal? Because
Sure.
I can help.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it. In the basics, it's just you're just spending more than you bring in. It just comes down to that, really.
Yeah, so
and you've
that's-
got unsustainable
that's all-
programs.
That's all financial and programmatic planning at play. I've made some comments around the fact that in general, there are always some bleep years, but in general, the school district, Napa Valley Unified School District, has been a district for a couple of decades with growth. A lot of that growth has been, the engine of that growth in terms of enrollment increase has been due to the development in American Canyon over the last couple decades, and I think people in the community are well aware of that. A lot of the times, districts that are in a growth mindset who've been able to rely on steady increases in enrollment, they add program, they experiment with program, they expand program. And when Rob pivots to the enrollment information, and our demographer, Rob, it's two Robs, so don't get confused, when he talks about the projections, you'll see that around that time was when we started to get the hints of a decline. And what I've learned in my professional career is that when that trend starts, a lot of districts maybe sometimes use hope as a strategy. Maybe this is just a year, maybe this is just 2 years, maybe it's going to pivot, maybe the economy's going to this is going to happen, all the X, Y's, and Z's that you could formulate around it. So at that point in time, there's probably insights around the fact that we were facing declining enrollment, which can be catastrophic for a school district. And if the school district doesn't sort of pivot, respond, tune into that close enough, and they continue to expand program, add program, which is what happened here. In the 14-15 school year, it was also a big increase from the state funding. And there have been people saying like, oh, there's been all this great funding over the last 5 years. Why is NVUSD in trouble? Well, I like to remind people that the increases in state funding are actually taking us back to simply the pre-recession levels. So it's not that all of a sudden there's been this expansive explosion in California public school funding. It's just in these last few years we saw the state finally getting us back to pre-recession levels, right? So that's there was that, getting pumped into the system. But what was happening here in our own context was this declining enrollment was happening. And if you weren't coupling the state revenue lever while also watching the enrollment trends, you could find yourself in a position where you could be adding very expensive programs or making financial and programmatic decisions at a point in time that maybe you had to have more of a forecast around what was around the corner. So there were expensive programs here. Rob's only been here, a couple months, but I've been here the year and a half and have worked closely, or not even a year and a half, 14 months, and have worked closely with the staff. But we added lots of teachers on special assignment in this district that were working outside of the classroom. We added a very expensive instructional model at the middle school, the 7-period day, which requires over 40 additional teachers. So there were decisions that were made at that point that were, what we say, program heavy, at a time when we were getting the hints of the decline.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the committee? Go ahead.
Just if you can expand a little bit more on this.
I'm sorry?
This year?
The majority of that cut had to do with what Dr. Massetti just basically called out. So it was a reduction in teachers who were on special assignment and the removal of 7th period. So to make that big cut, essentially what we did is we looked at how do we get back to our core? What are the easiest cuts that we can make that doesn't impact the classroom? We tried to make that as far away as possible. And so a lot of school districts go through that. It's not uncommon during times of where you have an expansion of revenue to kind of gear up expensive instructional programs, especially with instructional coaches or models like that. And then when things start to turn around, they have to quickly pull that back. So that's what we've done.
Any other questions? Okay. Go ahead, Kate.
Are we taking any of the charter? I know that River just lost its. Is any of that included in this year's numbers, or is that going to be projected for next year?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the only data that I use is verifiable data online. And so the answer to that, no, that is not in there. But to kind of cut to the point a little bit about what that means, is because everyone is saying, okay, well, we have a new charter, but for this year, again, we don't know our enrollment numbers for this year, the exact numbers. For all we know, the decline could be so heavy that it wipes it out. You don't know. You don't know until the data gets certified. And again, that certified data won't be available until December-ish. So we'll start to get trends now. I mean, one of the things that we start doing between now and October is we start comparing our data in our student information system, which is called ARIES, and then you compare it to a warm body count. So again, those of you who are teachers in the room or principals, I'm sure you've had that where principals come in your room and they ask you, you're in the middle of teaching a lesson, and they say, oh, by the way, how many kids are in your room? How many butts do you have in the seat? And then you're like, I'm too busy teaching, leave me alone, let me go back to this. And like, it's an important thing, obviously, right? I say this because I was a 5th grade teacher for a long time, and I remember having that and having to write that down on the board, and what do you mean, how could the number go down? No, that's wrong, and having to redo the whole calculation. So again, that's something that we'll monitor. What will happen between now and October is the ARIES number will go down, because usually the kids who say they're gonna show up don't show up. It's pretty common. And then what's going to happen is the kids who show up, they start to show up later, so the numbers will converge over time. But to get to the core of the issue, I'm going to kind of infer kind of what your question is, well, if we have these charters coming back, won't that fix things? And so again, I mean, that's just the crux of the question. If I were to just, am I correct?
Help it. I mean, it's not going to fix it.
It's not, yeah. So what does that mean? I'm sure people ask that question. So what does that mean? So remember, the costs come with those students too. So the costs of paying the teachers and the facilities are still there. What ends up costing districts when you have a charter, it's the slow bleed, you could say. So again, if I were to just throw out an example of a classroom, let's just take a classroom, let's just make it really simple. A classroom with 30 students in it. And so by the time you adjust all the costs in there and the cost of the principal, and if you were to say, the margins are really, really narrow. You can see that from our reserve there. Let's say the break even is 26 students to 28 students. We could argue either way. We could debate it all night. But what ends up happening to that classroom is, as you have that slow bleed to a charter or kids moving out, you drop below that number. And then maybe you're at 24, and maybe you're at 23, and you're at 20. And when you're at 20, can you spread out those kids? No, you can't, because you have class limits like you're supposed to in your contract. And so that class is costing more. And so that's what generally costs with the charter, and that's what costs with declining enrollment. That's also why with increasing enrollment, part of the reason that you're able to continue to overspend with increasing enrollment. You're already basically paying for everything, but you continue to get students through the year, and as you continue to get students through the year, that's just additional revenue you're getting on top of the cost, because again, not every student costs extra money. You get to a break-even point. Does that make sense?
Any other questions?
Question. At the first part of the presentation, Ms. Macy made a statement about 4 tasks for the committee, and they're fairly complicated kind of tasks. And so I'm hoping at some point, maybe at the end of this meeting, we can clarify those tasks. It'll help with coming up with questions and looking at the data. So what does the real purpose you expect out of this committee in terms of a vote, or what issues do you expect us at the end to be presenting to the board? So it'll help clarify our research and questions.
That's a great question. I had some regrets around my opening, and one thing I did not address was the fact that, and I think our legal counsel had mentioned it, but we're sort of using the 7-Eleven committee process above what I would call sort of the minimum requirement, right? Like, there's a couple pieces to highlight. We could have gone with just 7 committee members. We went with the maximum of 11. We made sure we had 4 representative, 4 alternates, right? So that's an example of us sort of going above the minimum process. And then, like they've stated, most of the ed code focuses on the surplusing of the property. And we've chosen to use this robust, highly technical, highly public process to also have the discussion around school closures. So our expectation is we're using 7-Eleven sort of with a dual purpose. Purpose number one is, and remember, it's advisory, so you're making a recommendation to the school board. This is not the committee that takes action on that, but that you would recommend, should Napa Valley Unified School District, based on the data, based on the studying of the issue, should they close any schools? If so, how many? If so, which ones? And then will come phase 2 of the work around, once that advice has come forward, those recommendations, and here are our recommendations for any potential surplus property. Have I described that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I think that really what the 7-Eleven committee and the superintendent's point is very well taken. The state doesn't mandate that you have to have a 7-Eleven committee. It's actually voluntary for the district. A process that would be quite functional would be simply to have it go to the board and have them go through this process with staff. This is really an opportunity for the district to demonstrate that they want to be transparent. They're taking you behind the scenes, and really what you're starting to hear is, and you're going to hear this from our demographer, is a district leadership comes in and they inherit programs and costs, and they're not going to turn on a dime. But what smart districts do is they partner with their CBO, as Rob has just noted, look at every single cost that they're inheriting and the programs that they're inheriting, and then look into the future with the demographer. And you're going to hear from Rob Murray right now, because what you don't want to do is say, well, things look pretty good now, let's just go year to year. No, you heard about how the state, the county, and FCMAT will come in and say, no, we want to see what you're looking like. To do that in the future, you have to have Rob Murray come in, a demographer, say what's happening with your growth trends, because that's where the preponderance of your funding is. So really what this process is to be transparent. We'll have a number of different meetings, hopefully between the committee and everyone, the community will have a really good sense of what's going on. But we will, to your question specifically, Eric, if there's things that we do not cover vis-a-vis what your role and what your responsibility is, please feel free to let me know. I'll make sure that we get that on the website and to you specifically, so you have that detailed, and I'll work with Megan on the legal side to make sure that's clear as well.
I think one thing I'd like to add is, I've tried to really commit ourselves as an organization to community and public engagement. I think I've held a lot of community engagement meetings around some of the complicated, challenging topics that we've faced since I started here in July of 2018. I think something that I would want to note is that there's been sort of a plea, I've gotten some personal ones, and I've responded to many of them, around wanting to sort of, can we take our time? Can we slow this process down? I think a couple of things to think about is that, well, when the school district's hovering over 3%, that may have been a conversation 5 years ago. It may have been a conversation 4 years ago. We are in a predicament where we have to make some, pretty big systemic decisions as laid out by Rob Manguala. So that's important. And any sort of conditional solutions at this point, like, well, what if we do this, over the course of the next 2 years, or what if we get an additional tax, or, these are not concrete that we could put in a budget to ensure the County Office of Education that we're going to stay fiscally solvent, because they're just dependent on way too many outside factors that we have very little control over. So we have to put in viable solutions as part of our fiscal judiciary responsibility. And something that I think the committee needs to be aware of is at some point, if we make the decision to sort of kick the can down the road around our fiscal reality, then you will have FCMAT and a fiscal advisor and the county office in here telling us what to do. There's no 7-Eleven committee, there's no community engagement, there's no discussion. It is you execute on these recommendations because you have demonstrated that you cannot manage your fiscal judiciary responsibility. So that's just some context setting for the situation that we're in.
And if I were just read a letter, a comment straight from the letter from the county office, it says, since 2016, the district has been projecting staffing reductions each year that were not fully implemented. And so we even have the county telling us at this point that we need to follow through on things this time. So, and again, this is a copy of this letter will be available very shortly up on the website. So the county is, I have paper copies, yeah. I don't know if I have the ability to pass it out right now or not. I don't know the legality of that, but we can certainly make it available. Yeah. Is that fine? Okay.
Yeah. More follow-up.
Or if you want, yeah.
Sorry.
Rob, I think Eric has another follow-up question.
Sure.
And I have a question. I know you have
Keep them coming.
Questions everywhere. Great, okay.
I like them.
Just to follow up, and it relates to the Napa County Office of Ed letter. One of the bullet points is right-sizing the district office, and I wondered what that, what.
Absolutely, and so I can address that, and then Dr. Massetti can talk a little bit more about it. But what that means is that, again, when you have too much staff, it's generally across the entire system, and we are definitely responding to that in terms of looking at where cuts need to be made, and we've made significant cuts at the district office. I don't know if you want to address some of that stuff that happened before I came here, Dr. Massetti?
Yeah, we've cut 4 administrative positions, so that's been substantial reduction. These were mostly positions that were funded out of the general fund, so there is a direct cost savings there. That helped reduce some of the deficit in the out years. I also believe when you're doing this work, it's important to model the model. So in my office, for example, there were 2 classified support staff, two assistants that worked out of my office. I made a reduction right out of my office. So my office has gone down by 50%. We've eliminated a director of communications, which again was a direct report to the superintendent. So I wanted to signal to the organization that it was, it's that serious that I'm gonna start with cuts in my office, and then we're gonna have to do an analysis across the organization and make sure that we're getting the district right size in terms of number of administrators. Sometimes you create a reality where you have less administrators, but you pay administrators more, so they take on multiple roles. When you get in the state that we're in, you can no longer run a district office where individuals have one sort of hyper focus on function and position. They got to be kind of, 3-tool, 4-tool players, because you can no longer have a position for every function in the district. So we just went from having elementary education and secondary education to K-12. That's an example of right sizing given our circumstance.
And then to add on to that, so just an example of a system that we put into place. So then I think on that slide, I mentioned position control. And so again, that's what gets a job, that's how you get paid basically. And so what we're looking at is every single position that comes up goes through cabinet. So if somebody leaves and they want to refill the position, we're not refilling it. We are looking at every single position during our weekly meeting in cabinet. So it doesn't matter if it's a custodian, if it's somebody in food services, if it's a principal, if it's somebody downtown. Every single position we're looking at, because obviously the best way to do this when you're right-sizing the district, you don't want to be in a position where you have to go through painful layoffs right away. What you want to do is look at it as through attrition. Ideally, you're going to be able to right-size the district through attrition, and with that said, every single position that goes through off, we're signing off on it. And it is slowing it down a little bit, I'll be honest. And so we get a little pressure, we get a complaint, why don't we have this person in food services or whatever, but we're literally looking at every position as it goes through the system.
And those are just fiscal practices. Again, you can be loose when you've got revenue and growth. Anybody who runs a business understands that when you're tight and you don't have a reserve, these are the kinds of fiscally responsible practices that an organization needs to adopt to avoid getting themselves in trouble.
Okay.
Laura? Oh, did you have one?
Oh, Eric.
Oh, it was me. For clarification purposes, if you can, and it can even be for next meeting, because it sounds like you've kind of been baptized in fire on this one with the amount of time you've been here.
Just a little bit.
If you could, get clarification on the actual time that the Yountville principal is on campus. I know it's going to be a small number, but it's also still a number. Like when we actually look, I'm a data guy, so I love all of these. The other thing is if you could find out for me, I loved how you did the average when you do it by per square foot based on your expenses,
yeah.
right? The custodial, I get it. So I'm asking you for an average. When I look at a number of 158,900 million or whatever in terms of total revenue expected for the year, divide it by the number of enrolled students, you get a number of 9,615. And I look at each school and you can see which ones are, but then you forget about, oh, by the way, we have all these district costs of all the district, right? So typically we look at that and say, what's your hard cost that you'd come off of every one of those students? Does that make sense? When I'm asking for a number per student of what would be a revenue for me, if I'm looking at it. So when I say it from my business, I'd look at it and say, well, look, every student, based on, let's say, the district offices and all of the district runs, and that's going to cost $3,000 a student, just let's say an easy number. That means that $9,615 per student revenue is actually really 6,615, right? So I'm just trying to get a general idea, so when I do the numbers, because it's easy to say, cut a small school, because they're saying you should consider them. The other side says is, cut a small school, or is there some other way to look at it? I'm just trying to look at the numbers that make sense.
Sure, we can
Does
get
that
back
make
to it.
sense?
Yeah, it doesn't
Oh,
direct,
next
it
meeting's
doesn't
fine.
directly translate, just to address that a little bit, it's not a direct translation, so again, to use a ballpark in terms of what do students generate, it depends on what source of funding. It's anywhere, if you, again, you look online, for LCFF only, which is the general fund, it's about $9,500. So
Right.
again, the number that Dr. Massetti calls out, that's correct. It's about $10,000. There's other sources of funds that bring it up above, a little bit above $11,000, but those are restricted funds, and they come with certain requirements. So that's why when we say it's about $10,000, it is about $10,000. It's honest. But some of the stuff, for example, it comes with heavy restrictions. So those are the restricted portion. Just one second.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the expenditure, again, like, well, how much do you charge back for that? There's a portion of it that you can attribute it to per ADA. You can say, okay, well, like to pay the teachers, for example, to pay the principal, but for the facility, that's not a correct way to do it. What you need to look at is you need to look at the size of the facility. That's how you build it back in, which is where that additional cost comes. So if you were to just divide it out right now, I mean, you could basically take the enrollment of that school right now, or any of the 4 schools, and divide it by that operational cost right there, and then that would give you a ballpark number right there. Is that what you're looking for?
No, the number I was actually looking for, because I was totally following, the number I was actually looking for is the district-wide. When you step away from the school, there's district costs that every one of those students have to pay, Dr. Massetti and everybody else.
Absolutely, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Indirect
So
costs.
I'm saying, what's that number that pulls off of that? I came up with $9,615. Again, it's an estimate. It's just a ballpark to get me to understand how it's working numbers-wise when we're looking at the details.
What's the hard cost expenditures up against the revenue generation?
Absolutely, because I think the way you broke it down per school is great. That made perfect sense. But there's also, otherwise I'd look at it and go, well, every school is profitable, and we know that's not the case,
We
right?
actually have a formula around that because when we did the work over the course of the last year around the charter schools, one of the issues was that we sort of unveiled in my preliminary budget analysis that the charters were not getting charged the full cost, right, of what it costs to sort of run a school. With that comes, okay, if you're getting services around student services, if there's the facilities cost, the maintenance cost, there's the special education cost, right? So we have a sort of, we have some numbers that we could show you in terms of per pupil cost around some of those services and how they go up against the revenue. And then I would encourage any committee members that have sort of, once you go home and kind of process the information, if you have any specifics around financials, one of the things that we're doing is, we're opening up the doors of our finance team, because we know finances can sometimes be looked at different ways. So if you need any, group time or some time to help understand something, through Dominic, we can help get that information and get more specific.
Thank you for your good question.
Okay, committee, is there anybody else that has questions?
I have a question.
Okay, sir.
I have a question to you. I'm looking at your elementary enrollment data.
Which slide is it?
It's called elementary enrollment data?
The bar, this one.
No, I think he's...
This one?
Oh, broken down by school.
Did I
Right after
find-
that.
Which one, Arvin?
You want to show it to me?
No.
Oh,
yeah.
with the, all the...
shows the, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
My question is this one. Why these students are getting smaller in your school when Canyon Oak is increasing?
You gotta use the mic.
I'm sorry. Did you ever try to find out why Yountville or first 5 schools are getting lower enrollment into school?
Yeah, so, we do have some data on that, so Rob Murray can talk about that a little bit. Generally speaking, in terms of why do schools get smaller, why are those schools small, and so forth, he can get into the data, especially like the number of families, for example, who live in the boundary that decide not to go there, or the ones that transfer in. So that's definitely a data point that he will be talking about specifically. But then again, another point that he'll talk about is just how expensive Napa is. And so one of the slides, if I were to preview it, Napa in particular is on the top 10 list of least affordable places to live, not in California, but in the nation. And so part of that is, obviously there's places with more expensive housing, but then if you take the housing and you take the medium income, it's exceptionally expensive to live in Napa, and it's hard for new families to live in Napa.
Okay, thank you.
You're going to see all of the enrollment data for the given schools.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to keep throwing you off. Sorry. I know that in the past, when I've come to in other meetings, they've talked about the fact that closing 2 small schools would save roughly $1 million a year. And I see that the cuts are 1.6 for next year, but then further out, the next year it's supposed to be even bigger. Is this going to be revisited again? Like, coming from a small school, is the small schools that stay open, are they going to be revisited again to be closed if the enrollment still is declining? Because the 5.6, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a big number, right? So I think it just depends on, I mean, this work has to unfold first. I don't think I can answer that in advance of this work unfolding. We're letting the process and the work unfold, and then we'll have to come to conclusions around the future.
All right, I have 2 questions. I'll be quick. I think there would be an interest in having some clarification around charter schools, and to be able to assure to this committee, and Dr. Muchetti just talked about it, that charter schools are paying back to the district for the services that they're using from the district. I think that's an important piece for the committee to have in terms of looking
Absolutely, yeah.
In terms of looking
You
at
want evidence of that, Barb?
I think just in a budget line, just to know that charter schools are, as you said.
Yeah, we'll show you the
I think
formulas.
that in terms of us trying to do our work, that's a piece of data that we need to have. The second question I have is about Yountville, Mount George, Alta Heights, and West Park, and perhaps the demographer will be talking about this, but looking at those schools and understanding who are the kids that go to those schools. Are they on inter-districts? Are they on intra-districts? Are they kids that live in those neighborhoods? And if they're not, if they're kids who are coming into those schools, what schools are they leaving? Because with the amount of elementary schools we have in Napa, it would be curious to me to know of these 119 kids at Yountville, 240 at Mount George, and so on, how many of those kids are neighborhood kids? And the kids that are attending that school that are not neighborhood kids, where are they coming from?
Sure. So I think he addresses most of that. I mean, if I were to just call off a number off the cusp, I think Yountville in particular, so 40 students are neighborhood students, and the rest are intras or inters.
So
and something like a third of the students who
We're
live.
gonna show you that.
We're going to show that.
Okay,
So why don't we let the data speak to that one?
Because
now?
what that does is it begs the question about what you were talking about with work and parents who, are bringing, I think, looking at the different reasons why parents are bringing their kids to these
Sure.
schools. Okay. All right.
Absolutely,
Thank you.
yeah. And so what we can do with that is I'd recommend after Rob presents his piece, because kind of right now, a lot of the questions, the last couple have been, Rob definitely addresses them. So what I'd like to do at this point, I want to kind of move things along, with your permission, pass it off to Rob. And then after Rob, remember, again, you'll get another opportunity to ask questions, especially if he doesn't address them. Does that sound fair, Barb?
Yep.
Okay,
Sounds
great.
Whitney, yeah.
About if a community member has a question about that piece.
We're going to address those all. We're going to address those all at the very end.
That's
Yeah,
all
we're
public.
going to get them all at the end.
Jen, do you want to do another question?
Yeah, if there's any more comment cards,
Comment
I can offer them. Or if anybody needs some.
And
Go ahead, Rob.
All right, thank you. So committee chair, vice chair, and committee members. So my name is Rob Murray. I'm here with Jack Schrader and Associates. We have prepared the full demographic analysis and facility capacity study, which will be presented at the next upcoming board meeting later this week. I know there has been a draft version that has been available for consultation. Some of the information in that, just over the last several weeks and months since that draft was initially released, we've been continuing to look at and refine data, work with the district to make sure that we're showing consistent enrollment with things. But I'll just be going through a few of the high points of that, touching on specific to the Napa-Yountville area, what some of the demographic trends have been, and then looking at those 4 specific small schools that are under consideration for this committee, and just some more specific information just about those. So a quick recap of, I know Rob touched on this, but the general methodology for what we're looking at when we're projecting future enrollment, because that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. And so big influencing factors, first we like to just look at it demographically, and this is you look at your incoming kindergarten every year is your single most influential factor that influences future enrollment. Every time that you have a bank of students and an incoming cohort comes in and a cohort leaves from graduating, anytime that that incoming cohort is smaller, then total enrollment is going to go down. And you can break that up, you can look at it, and on Rob's slides you'll notice that elementary enrollment in the district has decreased a lot more rapidly in the last few years. That's because you've been getting smaller kindergarten cohorts in the district. Those smaller cohorts, as the 5th grade class bumps up into middle school, you see it in the elementary enrollment first. Every time you have a small cohort come in and replace a larger cohort, total enrollment is going to go down. Eventually, those smaller cohorts are going to start hitting the secondary levels. You'll begin seeing a lot of that same enrollment decline going on in the secondary levels as well. We also, you heard the term cohort survival. We look at trends of, and this takes in a lot of information. You have the net gain and loss as families move into and out of the area. You just have parts of the district. So I mentioned this will be a Napa-Yountville presentation focus because the demographics in this area are different than they are in American Canyon. All the schools we're discussing are in the Napa-Yountville area. So American Canyon, you tend to have more positive cohort growth on net. You have more families moving in than moving out. You have more students enrolling from outside the district, various other factors that cause that. And I'll touch on this, what goes on in the Napa-Yountville area. It's a much more stable picture. Once a cohort comes in, it's not going to change in size drastically. So again, just emphasizing that the size of those incoming cohorts of new kindergarten classes is really what's going to be driving your future enrollment picture. And then we project future kinder that is based heavily on what local births have looked like. And I'll be showing you numbers of all of these in the coming slides, but this is just a good overview of the process that we're using. And then projections of the 1st through 12th grades. As Rob mentioned, you already know what your cohort looks like that's in the grade before, and as they move the next year into the grade up, and there's always going to be some change. It's that we don't live in a bubble. Families do get to move around, and some of them move away, other families move in. But we have a good idea, just based on historic averages and trends, what that's going to look like from year to year. And then you have residential development that brings in families that otherwise wouldn't live in the district, and those get added in as that development occurs. Now what we're looking at here, so these numbers, again, this is not looking at any schools in American Canyon, so this will not match any of the district-wide numbers that you've seen. But this is the enrollment of the schools in the Napa-Yountville area. You have the darker line with actual enrollment. And yeah, I'm not even in the fortunate position of being able to take on and off my glasses, but even with my glasses on all the time, yes, it is a little hard to see some of these numbers. But it looks like we're down to 12 to 14. Thank you. In the most recent year, when we're looking at, and just to be clear, what's being included here, this will be all of the non-charter schools in the district with the exception of Canyon Oaks, Donaldson Way, Napa Junction, and then American Canyon Middle and American Canyon High. Every other school is considered to be in the Napa-Yountville area.
Rob, can I just, for the record, one piece? So one of the practices of our new chief business official, Rob Manguala, and his ask of the demographers, there's versions of demographer studies that sometimes when you look at the actual enrollment is some of the preliminary counts, the informal counts that school districts do in their student information system. A demand that Rob Manguala has put on the system is when we look at actual enrollment, we are using the CBED October CDE verifiable data. So there have been some previous slides through the community meeting when we're doing kind of the big picture, hey, we have a problem, where you might see some disparity between some of the actual enrollment numbers, you know, and it's sort of within the general margin of error, but I want to be specific around that. In these presentations, for the purposes of the 7-Eleven committee, under the direction of the new chief business official, we are only, when we talk about actual enrollment, we are talking about the California Department of Education verifiable data. That has not necessarily been a consistent and practice here in the school district. So I just,
yeah,
I want
no,
to
thank you for,
because that's important to note.
Why do you, so I don't have a microphone. Why do you exclude charter schools from the demographics?
And in this case, that is just so that the enrollment numbers that we're looking at in our reports are matching the numbers that the district is looking at. As in this case, since we're focusing a lot on ADA generation, so we want all of the enrollment numbers to be identical.
Yeah, I've had to do a lot of clarification since the start of my tenure here around charters. So I'll take this as a moment to just reiterate some of the clarification. So in the past, the district has always, or not always, in recent reports that I reviewed over the course of the last few years, the request of district staff of the demographers, the budget reports that have been annually submitted to the board, the practice of previous administration was to include the students enrolled in the charter as part of our enrollment picture. Since I started here, especially given the context that I've described that we're navigating and working within, it's important to delineate charter students versus students enrolled in traditional district schools because we are dealing with financials. Charter students are part of our community. We have a positive working relationship with our charter schools. This is not a pro-charter or anti-charter dialogue. When we're looking at financials, we have to look at the students that generate revenue because of their attendance in our traditional schools. Many people that I've spoken to in the community over the course of the last year were not aware that when a student enrolls in a charter school, they are leaving NVUSD. We are their authorizer. We are the authorizer of the charter, but that student is actually goes to another local education agency, and their student count and their revenue generation goes to the credits of that institution, which is the charter school. So it creates a misconception when we're including charter students as part of this type of data because it inflates the number of, are those students in the Napa Valley Unified School District community? Absolutely. Are they ours? Are they kids in our community? Absolutely. Does their education matter? Absolutely. But when we're looking at this from a financial perspective, including charter students there would be a misconception because they don't generate ADA for the school district. They generate revenue for the charter school. The charter school takes the money, builds program, and buys some of their services to build that program from the school district. There's a lot of confusion in the school district, and so I'll tell you who the 3 charters are, or I'm sorry, now we have 2 charters. We had River Charter School. They could not manage the new cost, and so they now have become a district school. In October, on that official certification day, those students will be included in our counts. They are not currently, and they will not be here because they were enrolled in a charter school. NVLA is a charter school, and Stonebridge is a charter school. So there's 2 left. Many people think New Technology High School is a charter school. It is not. It is a district school.
Right. And so looking at that purely demographic enrollment projection before we get into residential development, and this is, I'll get into some of the details of why this is, but we anticipate that total enrollment in this area of the district will decline steadily over the next several years. And so touching on that, I wanted to get into, as Rob alluded to, kind of the backdrop of a lot of this demographics, and that is relating to housing and to affordability issues. Without getting into a whole bunch of numbers, again, our full study document goes into a lot of detail on a lot of these points, but broadly, there is a name for it, the Bay Area housing crisis. But broadly, what you are seeing is Economics 101. The population is increasing, the supply of housing is not remotely keeping pace with it. So as you have more demand for an increasingly limited supply, those prices go up. Just the example that I found going through census data that I thought illustrated this point very well, countywide over about the last 5 years. And again, we're at the tail end before we get the next full census hard count, but using the American Community Survey estimates, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 additional residents live in Napa County, a net gain. However, in the same time, only about 550 housing units have been added to the county. So you have about the population of another Calistoga of people coming in, and only about a fifth of the housing units in Calistoga being built to absorb that additional population. And so that is what drives prices up. And then, as mentioned, it's pretty much all Northern California and New York City boroughs, but the 10 least affordable counties in the country, just based on that intersection between the cost of housing and what local wages are. Napa is in that top 10 list. And again, you have close to half of the renter households in the district who spend at least 35% of their income on rent. That 35% figure is the highest category that the census questionnaire has. I'm sure a lot of those households are spending significantly more than 35%. You have the average wage earner, if you're just looking at average wages compared to median home prices, 84% of their income to be able to afford the median home here. So this is the backdrop for what we're seeing in terms of why births are going down. A lot of the families who would be in the position to be ready to start a family, to have those young children, are deciding to move somewhere else before they do it. And then we also look at the ratio of how many of those births translate into kindergarten enrollment 5 years later. And again, we're seeing that for the Napa-Yountville area, it is quite a bit less than 1. So again, even of those families who initially have children here, by the time they reach school age 5 years later, a lot of them aren't here anymore. So that's the backdrop that we're looking at when we're talking about this future of enrollment decline for the region. It's just important to have that context. So this quick chart of the births. And again, for the people looking at the screen, I realize that these numbers are difficult to make out, but I will go through the high points. Going back to 1990, there was a floor of, or a threshold of about 1,100 births that you could reliably get. And now these, and this is for these, and this is, I should mention, this is zip code births based on the residence of the mother collected by the California Department of Health. So this is data that's available online that anyone else can look up and go through to verify. But going all the way back to 1990, so in the zip codes that cover the Napa-Yountville area, 1,100 births every single year, year in and year out, sometimes more, but at least 1,100. 2010, you had the first year, these are the yellow highlights in this chart, below 1,100. And then from that time, you've actually been below that level more often than not. And again, previous to 2010, you had 20 straight years at least, and that's just going back to the first year of data available through the CDPH right now, above that threshold. With the most recent year of data released, 2017, births below 1,000 for the first time. So this really highlights.
These births are based on what? Where does the statistics come from?
So
Because
California Department of Health, this
county,
is,
like where the birth certificate was issued?
no, this is by the residence of the mother.
Residence of the mother, okay.
Right, so regardless of where the birth occurred, if people are, so people in American Canyon are going down to, to Vallejo for birth, it is, because at the time, with all the paperwork you fill out, and if anyone's ever been in a hospital, you know that there is a lot of that, but that is how the CDPH, the California Department of Public Health, tabulates that data, is by the residence zip code of the mother. And so that's why we're also confident that we are capturing births of people who are living at the time of the birth occurred in these communities. And then correlating with this, you have 5 years later, what is the kindergarten enrollment? And so, again, the ratio in Napa is fairly, and it hovers around, about 85 to 90% most of the time. Sometimes a little below, sometimes a little above. But we kind of average out all of this and look for most recent trends to weight the most heavily. But the main thing that you'll see with the kindergarten enrollment is that as you have these smaller numbers of births, you start seeing correspondingly smaller kindergarten cohorts. And again, this red highlight here, the most recent year, you had an 86% ratio, but you were dealing with a year that 5 years previously there had been a fairly low number of births, and then you have 871 kindergarten students enrolled in all the Napa Yountville schools in the area. For the next, we at least have the solid data point to work off of, is that for the next 4 years of projected enrollment, we already know what the births were for that cohort that will show up in kindergarten. So for the 3 of the next 4 years, again, you have 1 year for the 2019-20 enrollment year, the one that we are just now kicking off. That was your last year above 1,100 births. We're anticipating that kindergarten cohort will be relatively larger, but then 3 more years, including this most recent year that will be the 2022 kindergarten cohort, that will be just based on an ever-decreasing population of just how many young children there are in the district. So the next part of it, I mentioned that cohort survival, and this is just a good illustration. Really, Napa Yountville, incredibly stable once you get those students in. If you just take the entire K-11 population 1 year, then you compare it to the next year's 1st through 12th grade population. In other words, in a vacuum, the students that you would expect were there last year, and they'll be there again this year. You tend to have plus or minus 0.5% variation. But basically, once you have those cohorts in, they're going to stay about the same size as they go through. So again, it really is, you're looking at, you have smaller cohorts coming in, and every year that they come in, they're replacing a noticeably larger cohort that's leaving. And that is why total enrollment is going down year after year. And that's why you saw that trend line on that chart just steadily going down, because we're seeing these small cohorts lined up, ready to come in. And you had those growth years in the past, and those are the cohorts that are in your secondary schools now, the ones that are being replaced. So that's why you have such a noticeable, just dropping by a number in the hundreds usually every year of the difference between what's coming in and what's going out. So we do look at residential development to build in Napa Yountville. There is some. Again, I do want to emphasize also that everything I'm talking about here in the area projections applies also to the way that we project enrollment for each individual school. Very little of the development happening in the Napa Yountville area is happening in these 4 particular school boundaries. There are a handful of small subdivisions with a few single-family homes, but again, the projects in this part of the district that are set to generate the highest number of students are not happening in the schools that we're discussing, so that helps make it kind of a level apples-to-apples playing field. And then also, just the total number of students that we're seeing generated from the residential development that is happening, it will help somewhat offset the demographic enrollment declines, but compared to the extent of what we're looking at with the demographic projection, you can see that you have the gray line there that's the original projection that I showed a few slides ago, and then the higher line that builds in new students coming in from new development. So the numbers are higher, but the trend line is essentially the same. So now I want to move into some specific analysis of the small schools. So for each of the 4 schools, I'm just going to quickly go over just a little bit of information that I've put together. First, there'll be a slide that shows an enrollment projection for each school. So again, this is looking at, for each individual school, that cohort survival and while the Napa average is steady, certain individual schools might have a tendency to grow or decline at that school from grade to grade, so we take that into account. We look at typically the percentage of the total number of kindergartners that school has enrolled over its history, but keep And then it's very important to keep in mind the total number of kindergartners to split between all these schools is dwindling. And then after the enrollment projection, there'll just be a slide that analyzes, I know that had that question, just the percent of students in each school that are the percent of enrollment that is coming from residents versus non-residents, and then the flip side of that, of the students who live in that boundary, what percentage of them are going to the school and what percentage of them are transferring to attend a different school. So looking first at Yountville, again, for most of these schools, we will be projecting declines in enrollment. I know there will be some, again, the full study that we we'll be presenting to the board on Thursday. We'll have some more full detailed enrollment numbers, but for these projections, continuing declines, and then looking at, so on the left will be the enrollment at Yountville. So in this case, that is, and pardon me while I refer to my hard copy here in front of me. So in the most recent year, 31% of the enrollment in Yountville was from residents of that school boundary, with 69% coming from somewhere else outside of that boundary. And then you can see that has fluctuated some, but has been, it's been as high as 43% resident enrollment and as low as the 31% this year, flipping that over to the boundary of the students who live in that boundary, who enroll with NVUSD. Then in the most recent year, 67% of those students enroll at Yountville, with the remaining 33% enrolling in a different Napa Valley Unified School District school. So then looking again at Mount George, with the enrollment projection, again, showing anticipated decline, a lot of this being driven by, again, fewer kindergarten students to go around, and then as you get smaller cohorts coming in, they replace larger cohorts who are leaving, and total enrollment will decrease every time that happens. So with Mount George, just looking at that spatial analysis, we have, again, Mount George's enrollment is made up of about 26% of students who live in the boundary, 74% coming in from outside, and then of the residents in the boundary, 74% of them do attend Mount George, with 26% leaving to attend a different district school. Alta Heights, again, enrollment shown to decrease from current levels. And then with their spatial analysis, 39% made up of the enrollment made up of residents of the school boundary. And then of the boundary residents in the most recent year, 66% of them enrolling in the school whose boundary they live in. And then for the last one, okay, so West Park, and again showing projected enrollment decreasing overall over the projection period that we're looking at. And then for their spatial analysis, 60% of the enrollment being made up of residents of the boundary, and then of the boundary residents, 47% of them enrolling in the school within which they reside. And that is the information that I have prepared to share with the committee tonight, and I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions? Oops. Questions from the committee? Any questions on Rob's presentation? Eric?
One quick question, just for clarification.
Yes.
Did you, based on your projections, like you're obviously, it's based on the 94558 zip code, did you put in the percentages and each school kind of took the same projection? Because for example, when I saw, I mean, it's easier to see the number.
Mm-hmm.
With Yountville, it drops from 119 to 100, which is, 15, 16%. But when you look at something like West Park, which would be the biggest school, drops from 313 to 286. Is that, I mean, I would assume you seem like you really know your numbers.
Yeah.
Or is that based on just straight percentages?
Okay. So yeah, this will be a little bit of a multi-part thing. So the first thing we look at is, the hardest part is what's that next year's kindergarten, those brand new kids, going to look like. And so that's the one where I mentioned we look at historically, on average, what percentage of the total district kindergarten enrollment is enrolling in each of these schools. And so that's what we are using for the assumption of any particular school's kindergarten. And that's, we're not just looking at the most recent year, we're using a weighted average of the last several years, and then taking into account if there are just any outliers looking into what may have been happening that was a one-time occurrence or something that might happen again that we would then want to look at that year, particularly if those conditions are applying again. But overall, we get a, just for the coming year, we have a total area projection of what kindergarten is, and then each school gets their percentage of that. And then for the other grade by grade, it's like we had talked about, except this time looking at it each individual school. So typically from between kindergarten and first grade every year, do you tend to, you have some, some kids leave, some kids come in who are new, but just on net, do you tend to grow or decrease from grade to grade? And so some schools do have certain grade levels where they get a bump or a decrease year after year. And then some schools also in recent years are showing what we call negative grade to grade migration or cohort survival, when several years ago they were fairly steady the last couple of years. And I don't have all the full tables in front of me. I don't want to say particularly which school is which, but I was just looking over these. And one of the schools under discussion, I know the last 2 years has really started shedding some students from grade to grade. And so that's all taken into account. And then, of course, one of the big things, I know one of the schools has a very large 4th grade class right now, or in 2018 when this data was put together, that will be their 5th grade class now. And you're going to see a big drop when that 5th grade class leaves, just because it's making up a disproportionate amount of their total enrollment, and you have a smaller kinder coming in the next year. So all of that goes into it, yeah.
Any other questions from the committee? Okay, go ahead, Katie.
I can't speak for all the schools, but I can speak for the one I'm involved with. We have been kind of told that it's going to be, open enrollment is going to run a little bit differently this coming school year. And I know in the past we've had a lot of interest in our school, but people have been turned away for coming there or told that, it's full. But I was wondering whether or not is that going to change in this upcoming year, whether or not more people are going to be allowed to go to their school of choice, or how that's going to look, because that would also influence these numbers in the future.
So in terms of open enrollment, we definitely have some special work to do around this. I mean, once the committee is done with their work, it will look slightly different, where our intention is to have open enrollment at the same timeline that we've always had, because we don't want to hold up open enrollment for this process. We don't want to affect the entire community over it. So our intent is to have the exact same timelines that we've always done around open enrollment, and that same process will be there. But if you, again, what we will be doing is we will notify people with a letter if you're, again, this is potential because we do have to run this by legal, is that if you're going into a school that may close, there'll be an additional notification in the future, right? So we don't know what that looks like, because there's still work that needs to be done in terms of the 7-Eleven committee. But in terms of, like, generally speaking, what I've seen from working in enrollment, not this one, I do have a background in enrollment. What happens with inter-district transfers, you let in enough intra, again, transferring from one school to the other school, you let in enough for the space given the teacher capacity at the time. So you don't, for example, and usually you don't see a big number. Usually what you'll see for a given class and a given grade level, there might be 4 spots, for example. Let's just take my example of a class sitting at 30 students, and the max is 30, and you've got 26 students in the class. And so if you get 6 people that apply for it, you're going to let those 4 in. You're not going to be able to financially add a teacher for those other 2 students, nor will you financially be able to move the other students that came with that teacher. It just doesn't work. It would just disrupt the system. So then when you do your intra-district transfers in general, the rule is they need to come in packages like that works for a district. That's my 1 year. You might see that, hey, I didn't get in. What happened? That's usually what happens.
And I do want to mention what Katie has identified. I think that's a communication issue, right? So that's all about improving communication. It's the issue where we have this hybrid system where there's enrollment at schools and open enrollment centralized. We just have to get better about our enrollment processes, because when you have a bifurcated system in the way that we do, where we handle it centralized for open enrollment, but then we distribute it out to individual schools and offices, right? So it's decentralized for regular enrollment. There's all kinds of communication breakdowns that happen. So what I would say is that I think you're absolutely right. The district has communicated in the past. I've only been through one open enrollment situation here, because I've only got 1 year, where they say things like the school is full. And then the schools like these that have big and open enrollment numbers say, what do you mean it's not full? We still have some capacity, but it's this threshold piece. So it shouldn't be communicated that the school is full. It's that we have to do a better job of communicating, well, this is the threshold. Yeah, there might be 8 requests for a kindergarten, but, or 6 requests for a kindergarten if, like he said, there's 2 open spots and we give 2, we don't open up another class for, 4 kids. And so the message then goes out, you didn't get into Mount George, or you didn't get into Yountville. And we probably need to fine tune what the communication is, because I've heard a lot around the insistence that, oh, they're full. Well, obviously, we're not full anywhere. I got declining enrollment. So I told my staff, you shouldn't even be using that terminology. We're not full anywhere. I got empty seats all over this district. So that's the wrong verbiage. And so we have to refine our communication around that. So I think, based on just my analysis, I've had personal complaints that have come to my office about past practice in the district. I've sat down with parents who've shared their frustration with me around the enrollment process. I think there's been a lot of room for improved communication, and it's as a consequence of that. I heard that in my first 90 days, and as a consequence of that, we have an enrollment plan and centralization plan to get all those improvements in place. So
Is that going into place this year? Or
not the full model, because we haven't been here long enough to get all the technical setup for it. So I'll toss to Rob, because he's leading that project.
Yeah, so part of the work, and again, we discussed this very heavily in the beginning of this process, is, again, we don't want to cause chaos in the system. There's enough chaos already with discussions around 7-Eleven and some of the other stuff that's going on. In terms of like completely redoing the enrollment process, which we should plan for, right? It takes time to do that correctly. We want to make sure that we do a very good job, and we don't want to put families through something like that with everything that's going on right now. And so we made an intentional decision to keep things status quo for now, and then take our time, build a system that works. But one thing that we can commit to is making sure that the communications go out are really good. So we will definitely look at that very closely with a heightened lens.
Particularly around open enrollment, especially with this topic on the table. So, we'll be talking about that as the work unfolds.
Okay. All right. Any other questions from the committee? So we have reached 7:30. We have one more presentation to go through. So I'd like to ask the members of the committee if you would like to forge forward. We do still have questions from the audience that we will need to address.
Public comment.
Public comment. Okay. And, or another option, we could take a quick 5-minute break and then come back. Committee, thumbs? If we want to take a quick 5-minute break?
Just carry on.
Okay. Yes? All right. I'm going to make a decision that we're going to take a 5-minute break. We will come back in exactly 5 minutes and begin with the facility study of small school operations.
I'll take that. Okay. You don't need to. Yep, you don't need to.
I had to read it twice.
Are these both you? You only get one comment, one set of 3 minutes.
But it's okay.
So I'll take one, and you got to jam it in 3 minutes.
Yeah.
You're doing
So-
a great job. Seriously.
So the way public comment works, because it's a Brown Act meeting, if you put out questions we can't answer. So it's an opportunity for public comment. So I think what you want to do is say, knowing it's a Brown Act meeting, I don't expect answers right now, but here are my 2 pertinent questions I'd like the committee to consider. So I'm going to take one card, and you'll say that in the 3 minutes. Does that make sense? Nope. No, we can't engage in a back and forth in this Brown Act setting. You can ask me a question outside of the committee. You can ask it now. Yeah. I thought you meant in the, yeah. I did that in June. That is the budget assumption. That assumption rolls. We've taken out the operational cost for the future.
अभी 5 मिनट की ब्रेक हुई है तो मैं सोचता हूँ आपको फोन कर ले। चलो ठीक है। ओके, हैव अ नाइस ट्रिप देन। ओके।
I'll pull it up right now. Yeah. Let's see here.
If there are any more comment cards, you can bring them up. Thank you.
That's the presentation I could do.
Way to go.
This one's up on the website under the business office.
The whole system.
But yeah,
kindergarten.
it's the same. Same slide.
He finished.
So when I was saying comments around balancing the budget, so we balanced the budget, the $7 million balanced the budget for the current year.
His junior at finished high school, so 2 more years done from the school district. But it's been good. I have no complaints.
The charter students.
My son went to Pueblo Vista.
Yeah, and their
Middle
cost.
School and Phoenix.
And the cost.
My daughter went to Bel Air.
Yeah, so we put
Redwood and Phoenix.
a budget assumption, even though it's not official certified data, we put in a budget assumption that those students would be counted back. And we use their preliminary count. It's not exact. That'll get all refined once they're on the books through CDE. The other assumption that's in here is not opening American Canyon Middle School. I don't know if you've heard all that. So that's another $2.1 million. The district had this school scheduled to open for 2021 or 21-22, which would have increased this by $2.2 million. So there was a commitment to build that school. They didn't really look at the enrollment trends, and they never put the cost of operating the school in the budget. So
I was the soccer coach for them, so same thing.
We call our Mount George family because we just know everybody there.
Yeah.
So it's great that
we're in discussions with the developer. It doesn't look like
wonderful.
We don't have what you're seeing here because of it's the bigger issue. It's the cost of living and the disparity in income. And he didn't bring this up, but one of the big data points we saw is the average age in the county is increasing. I think the average age in Bill now is
it's good that we have this.
It's second home, retirees, that kind of a thing. And so that's one of the main pieces. It's cost of living, and then who is coming in isn't coming in with kids. So it's a crisis. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it.
Okay, folks, if you would like to return to your seats,
Your mom, where?
we will go ahead and get started with the next presentation. Thank you.
Your Mount George mom.
Pardon? Yeah. Also, as we get ready for the next presentation, any comment cards, please give to Jennifer up here in the
All
front.
the kids that come from other places, they just go, they have a homeschool. And they now would, if they don't want to go to their home school, they just open enroll to another school.
Your elementary teacher.
Yeah. Basic capacity is important.
All right, we are going to begin. 5, 4,
I got to make sure they understand.
3, hurry,
Thank you.
2, 1. Very nice, very nice. We're going to continue with the last presentation tonight, which is the facility study of the small school operations. And I believe Mr. Pearson will be leading us through that. Mr. Pearson.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Pearson. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Operational Services. I won't be going into quite the detail that Rob and Rob went into. You might be thankful for that. I'm not sure yet. I did look at one of the slides, though, so some of this information is a little bit smaller, but we'll try to walk you all through it. And essentially, it's not the same data, but it's the same sort of data points that I'll be mentioning for the following schools. So let's start with Alta Heights. Oops, wrong direction. Let's start with Alta Heights. So with what I'm going to be doing is highlighting the following information: the usable site acreage, the total square footage of the buildings at the school site, some highlighted years about construction, the total classrooms available, the classrooms that are utilized, and this is current, the total capacity, student capacity, the total CDE enrollment from 18-19, and then you also will see the 18-19 enrollment. So I just want to make sure that, first of all, we're oriented on this, and that is that you are looking at the 18-19 enrollment. You are not looking at 19-20 enrollment. So in some instances that may not match up with the number of classrooms, and you can if you start doing the math real fast, you might say, well, wait, there should be 12 classrooms here or 13 classrooms utilized. We're looking at the 18-19 data. We actually had staff go out to the sites to talk with the site principals about the number of classrooms that they are currently utilizing. Everybody with me on that? Okay, great. So starting with Alta Heights, it sits on approximately 5.5 acres. When we talk about the total square footage of the buildings, we include the classrooms, the multi-purpose rooms, the daycares, the libraries, the computer labs, anything that there's a structure on there that NVUSD has its name attached to, that's part of our total square footage. On the years constructed, and going back and look at previous data, and we're looking at Alta Heights, there was a major construction that happened in 1948, another major construction that happened in 1953, and then the year 2006, I wanted to highlight that that's when the multipurpose room and some other modernization had happened on that particular site. When it gets to the number of classrooms available, if you were to walk out to Alta Heights, there are a significant number of rooms available. And they have some rooms that are, for example, a sensory room, and they have a staff room. So some of these weren't counted as actual classrooms. They could be used as actual classrooms if we had to expand the number of students at that particular site. And what happens when school sites get smaller is that a good principal is going to start using that space in ways that serve the needs of that particular school site. So they start to migrate out into other buildings. And that's no criticism against a principal. Being a former principal, I was very good at migrating out into other spaces. But we looked at what we thought were the right number. So the total classrooms available would be 17. The total classrooms utilized currently are 11. And as I shared, the total capacity is 375, and the CDE enrollment from 18-19 at Alta Heights was 295, and then we just broke down the number of students in each grade level. If we move on to Mount George, again, very similar information as far as the things that we were looking at. It sits on approximately 6 acres. Total square footage is 16,139, and again, I went over the things that we include in that. It's had 2 significant years of construction in 1936 and then in 1950, and then we didn't highlight it yet, but we did have in 2018-19, we did improve the septic system out at Mount George, so that was another major thing that happened. Currently, there are 11 classrooms available, 10 are utilized, the capacity is 275, and the total enrollment in 18-19 was 240. And again, you can look at the enrollment by grade level. Moving on to West Park. West Park is the largest of all the campuses. It sits on almost 9 acres, has 18,229 square footage available. It's had 3 years of significant construction in 1955, 1960, and 2007. Again, that one's a multi-purpose. We did not list also, but in 2018 and 19, it went through some retrofitting as well too, for earthquake purposes. There are 17 classrooms available. 14 are being utilized. The total capacity is 337. And the CDE enrollment was 313 students at that particular site. And then finally at Yountville. Yountville sits on almost 7 acres. Square footage of the buildings is 24,656. 3 major years of significant construction: 53, 1996, and then 2005. And again, that would reference the multipurpose room. There are 11 classrooms available. 5 are utilized. The total capacity is 175, and the CD enrollment is 119. That concludes my study of the capacity of the school sites and the facilities. There are questions?
Barbara, any questions?
I actually have a question, Mr. Pearson. So do all of the schools do room utilization, like a room utilization matrix, so that
This is the first year they'll be doing something like that we'll be asking them for.
So not only will you know the number of classrooms that are available, but you'll know actually how many are being used across the district.
And let me just qualify that. It's not that this will be the first time that they'll be doing that. They do that, but everybody does it sort of in a different format, and we'll be sending out to staff consistent formatting, so we know that room 1 is used by teacher X, or room 2 is not used by anybody. It's actually a maker's room or something like that. Room 3 may be,
sensory room.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Pearson. I have a question. Just a data difference between looking at Yountville and Mount George. So they both have total classrooms available of 11, and the usage is different. But with the same number of total classrooms available, the total capacity is a 100 student difference, and I wondered why that's the case. It says 275 total capacity for Mount George with 240, and at Yountville with the same number of classrooms, it says total capacity is only 175 with 119 the current enrollment. So I just wondered why there was a capacity difference of 100 students.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that, Mr. Knight, in regards to that discrepancy on that. Let me double check.
Just let him go.
That's fine. If you want to come back to
I'll have to get back to you on the answer to that. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the committee for Mr. Pearson? Okay. Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so this is your opportunity. I believe we're at the conclusion here. So what we are now going to do, and I'm going to turn it over to Barbara to also facilitate this, but this is your opportunity to provide public comment. Just as a reminder, as a Brown Act type of committee, just like a school board or city council, it's not a question and answer period. So what's going to happen is if you can provide your comments, if you have questions in the form of, here's something that I've thought of that I did not hear an answer to tonight, feel free to say that. What we're going to do is we are fastidiously typing down all of the various questions, hoping to list these all down, provide an FAQ perhaps on site, and then when we come back to the September 3rd meeting, we're going to be addressing many of the questions if we did not already address them, or the committee did not already address them through some of their questions. So I think that we are going to have, if I'm correct, Superintendent, 3-minute I think limits. So Barbara, just so you know, you're going to need a timer.
Right. We have that. No, we have
You
a
have
timer
that?
coming up. A
Okay.
timer coming
So
up.
we'll manage that process. Okay. So with that, Superintendent, did you want to go through the cards? You want me to read off the
I've
cards?
given them to the chair. She's.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
Work.
Oh, you've already done that. She's way ahead of me.
Ready.
All right. Very good. Thank you very much.
And just a quick message to the committee. Part of our responsibility, as shared by the varying people that have presented to us, is to listen, and this would be that part. This is that listening part. We won't be making any comments, but we'll be listening. And I think we need to really key in to what people are sharing with us, because I think all of the feedback will help us decide, make decisions about what direction we're going to head. All right? And with that, I'd like to call the first speaker up, Samantha Holland, and she will be talking about the small school closure.
Good evening. Thank you all for your service. So mine mainly lean towards the question arena, so I understand that I will not get a response. So my first, it's not really a question, it's a statement. Eric did mention about verifying Yountville's principal status as part-time and how those numbers equate. And I would just add, it shouldn't just be when the principal is on site, but actually how much time she spends focused on the foster and homeless youth liaison program that you currently have her at 50% of. So I haven't paid enough attention in the past few years to see that that's not being charged to the appropriate place, obviously. So not just when she's not on site, but when she's actually focusing on alternate work. So I also was looking at the verifiable data for enrollment. My question was, are charters also seeing a consistent drop in data, or are students from NVUSD's typical schools moving to charter or private, which you won't know private, but you could see if their data mirrors that. I also noticed that you don't estimate River School coming under NVUSD enrollment data for now, but why is it not included in the future projections? As you know, that's going to take place, you stated, as of October. So under the school resident analysis slides that the gentleman presented, so you show a percentage in each school that were enrolled in a different NVUSD school. So just to make sure the data is consistent, because I'm a data person, that's kind of why I asked for it ahead of time. But does that include charter schools? So when you're saying a enrollee goes to a different NVUSD schools, is it still apples to apples? Are they going to a charter school or are they going to an NVUSD school? So my last statement is about open enrollment, which causes me a little bit of anxiety, as I'm sure it probably does to other people in the room. What happens when we close these schools and you have not adapted the time frame for open enrollment? You will create chaos that you're not anticipating, is what I think. Running this process concurrently with open enrollment will create chaos. And I think it will also create a very uncertain environment for the decision-making of this body, because you're gonna have parents fretting over what's gonna happen and making long-term decisions for their students to go to other schools because you're putting them in a box of a time period. And my other question is, you're saying, I guess it's a question or a statement, but there's not a lot of, there's onesie-twosie spots in all these schools. So let's say you close 2 schools, where are you gonna put those kids? Are you gonna split them up amongst all the other district schools in onesie-twosie amount? I mean, I think it's really important to have a plan in place. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker is Amy Pierce, and she has questions about the budgets. So you want to come on up?
Good evening. I actually had some clarification on this in the break period, but the question I had was related to the 2020-21 and the 2021-22 budgets that are proposed, and noting that those do factor in the assumption of 2 small school closures. And so just keeping those in mind, that there are still those deficits in those years. I do have a second part, and that would be related to open enrollment, and also understanding if the committee is going to be putting together a proposal for redrawing district lines, along with a proposal to close the small schools, and if that will happen before the open enrollment period, so that better decision-making can be made there. So those are just my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you. Linda Mondavi, and she'll be talking about Yountville Elementary.
Hi, thank you. It's Lydia Mandavi. I am a parent of Yountville Elementary School. Thank you for allowing me to speak this evening. A few points that I'd like to ask. We have seen a lot of data tonight. Thank you so much for providing it. I need to look at it online to view it a little bit clearer. Where are the projections specifically on budgets if we're looking at approximately $7.2 million over the course of the next few years? Where are the projections on what we're really going to do? Because closing 2 schools of the 4, or closing all four closing of the schools, will not accomplish that deficit of $7.2 million. So where are those financials? Also, how many kinders total in the district do we really have? Like, how many kinders total does the district really have right now? And where are they? What are we doing to market to those families to keep them in the district and to actually capture them for the district? We need a sustainability plan, and we are not looking at that sustainability plan for marketing and strategy moving forward. We're looking at what do we do right now to take real property and assets and get rid of them. As we look at that, we also need to look at what are the permits for those 4 schools? What is their use permit? What can you do with them? Can you really just sell off the asset? And is that going to help you? Also, how many of the current students that are going to be exiting, you're looking at 500 to 1,000 students that would be merging into other district schools. What does that do to the teachers? What does it do to the classroom size? And how do those families that are currently in those schools feel about it? How does Vichy, how do those families feel about all of our children moving into those schools? And how do those teachers feel? What are they going to do? Are they going to go to private? We saw 25% of our student body out of kinder at Yountville Elementary School leave. 5% out of district, 20% to private schools in 1 year. The threat is real, the budgets are real, but how do we look at other sustainability options? We are an affluent community with a diverse population. How do we look at marketing and strategy moving forward? This is a business. We need to tackle it like a business and not put a Band-Aid on it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Our next speaker is Mike Stevens, and he'll be talking about Yountville.
Thank you guys for being part of this. I have a child at Yountville Elementary. I'm a past PTA president. I'm a board member and a coach at the Little League there for 6 years. I live in Yountville. My son's gone there for 7 years because they had a transitional kindergarten program. I guess my plea and my ask of this committee tonight is more emotional than it would be factual, and there's a lot of facts here tonight. I know it, and I'm talking specifically about Yountville. I'm not talking about the other schools because I don't know the other schools. But I know specifically we went through something like this a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, that we were looking at closing Yountville, and it affected enrollment. It's not to the numbers that I see all the other schools. Yountville's never going to be close to those other schools in enrollment, but I think you would have had a robust and healthy environment had we not had this conversation, and now we're having it again. I know I'm also a coach in some other sports in Napa, and I've got people who come up, oh, you're in Yountville? Aren't they closing your school? That was 2-3 years ago. So I know those people aren't even thinking of Yountville as a possibility for their child. And then secondly, that negative impact by the district, I don't think was ever, we never did anything about that. There was never like, hey, Yountville's going to be around after 3 years ago, and so we've always been under that. And the second, selfishly, I think you have to look at what it's going to do to the community itself. And if Yountville Elementary goes away, Yountville Little League goes away, there's other things that impact it besides a financial and a factual. So just look at all of those options, if you would. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Jason Hutchings, who will also be speaking on Yountville.
Hi, my name is Jason Hutchings. I'm a 15-year resident of Yountville. My son is a first grader there at Yountville Elementary School, and he's a neighborhood kid in the school. That school's been open since the 1880s, one of probably the oldest schools in the county. I'd like to acknowledge Principal Bianchi. She's an amazing principal. I couldn't ask for a better individual to be the principal of my child's school. As mentioned earlier, she does wear multiple hats for the school district. She is the foster child and homeless youth liaison, as well as the principal there at Yountville. You know, the Yountville's been under the threat of closure 3 times in the past 10 years. And the first time, a parent club was formed, and ever since, we've raised close to $100,000 a year for the school. Just wanted to note that. This year in the kindergarten class, there's close to 25 kids that are going to school right now in the kindergarten class, and that's with news of the closure. So without that news, there was probably going to be close to 30 kids in that class. In the past couple of years, there's been 2 affordable housing developments in the town, and we are just now starting to see the fruition of those developments where those kids, those families are now coming into the school. On my street alone, there's 5 kids that go to Yountville Elementary School, all second grade or younger. There are 2 kids that go to Bel Air because their father works close to Bel Air. There's 1 child that goes to private school. You know, if Yountville were to close, it's the only elementary school between El Centro Elementary and St. Helena. So that's close to, 15, 20 miles of an area that there would be no school. And it'd be tough, you know, to force my child to have to then commute at 55 miles an hour down a highway for 10 miles just doesn't seem fair. I'd also like to mention the Parks and Recs Department. Garrett Kuehl runs an amazing aftercare program, one of the longest running in this district. If the school were to close, there would be some serious collateral damage to that program. That program, through parental support, funds a lot of the senior programs in the Park and Recs Department, a lot of arts programs in town. So speaking of collateral damage, I'm also the president of Yountville Little League, and our league would basically fold without having kids at the school for player participation. I also want to touch upon real quick, you know, I'd like you guys to remember that this is not a business. This is a school district. I believe your communal responsibility outweighs your fiduciary responsibility. My family, we need money to get by, but we're not a business. Our efficiency is judged by love and happiness. I believe a school district's efficiency should be judged by the success of its students. Let's see a graph as far as how many kids from these small schools go on to college. That'd be a statistics I think we should be judging efficiency by. Anyway, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Johnette Thornson, and she'll be speaking on school closures. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Johnette? No? Okay, maybe she stepped out. We'll circle back. Oh, there you are.
Sorry, I'm so emotional. I just get so emotional when it comes to my child. So he's in the TLC program. He was at Northwood. He was just recently moved this year to West Park by the district. This will be his 6th school. He's only 7. If the school closes, it'll be his 6th school. My son has special needs, and they really need consistency. And with being bounced around to different schools, he's not going to get that. And I just don't know where his future will be. If West Park closes, where is the TLC program going to go? That's it.
All right, thank you. All right, our next speaker is Megan Clark, and she'll be sharing her thoughts on IB and small school sites along with mental health.
So thanks for having me. I am Dr. Megan Devania Clark. I'm a psychologist, and I am also a parent to students at Mount George. We are in a time of crisis in mental health. I think we can all agree. I'm sure you educators are familiar with the ACE screening. I'm very involved in that in the organization I work at. So adversive childhood experiences, we have a lot of families who have family members deported, and what we know about what makes people resilient. The number one is people who care. If you walk around any of these small schools, and Mount George in particular, these are people who care. I ran into a teacher the other day at the grocery store who has never had my children, and she knew who my kids were. And the parents get out of their cars, some drop off, but at Mount George, we get out, we talk to each other. Every person knows my kids. We go to a dine and donate. Who's that kid? Oh, that's a kid in 5th grade. I'm in kindergarten. Mount George also has the Big Buddies program. And maybe other schools have this, but I know that this is what fosters mental health and healthy kids. If we're looking at cutting a school like this, you're talking about money that's going to come that you're going to have cost other places, with kids missing school, with bullying, so kids missing out. Mount George, if there's bullying, it's nipped in the bud like that because all the teachers know about it and all the parents talk about it. So, you know, it's something that I really want you to consider, the mental health of our community, because going to Snow or Sheer, that is not healthy. Now I see maybe going, I might be controversial here, but maybe having those kids come to Mount George where we've had space and people are turned away, that is what makes sense. Closing a small, high-functioning school, and especially the IB principles of Mount George versus other small schools, the IB principles of being a risk taker, being an inquirer, being caring, and really caring about the other kids, that is so special. And you can actually, I've done some research on IB schools, and kids that come from disadvantaged backgrounds, they go to college at a higher rate. So you're looking at closing one of the best schools, and my kids will definitely not be part of the helpful budget, as I think a lot of other parents, because this is a special school. And I had a client of mine the other day say, I was going to enroll in Mount George, but the thought of them closing, I just can't deal with it. Mount George is a special school and should stay open.
All right, our next speaker is Adriana Bordeaux. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, or fairly, or close enough that you knew it was your name.
Yes, right? I'm going to try not to talk too loud. I work with toddlers, so I'm used to projecting. My name is Adrienne Boudreau. I have 2 kids at Mount George, a 3rd grader and a kindergartner that just started this year. When we first heard about school closures, I know a lot of parents at Mount George were really upset, and we started thinking about all these fantastic things about Mount George that made sure it should stay open. And then I think about my friends at West Park and Alta Heights and Yountville, where I worked for a number of years, and how they have just as many equally amazing things, I'm sure, about their schools, and they deserve to stay open for just different, but I'm sure equally numerous reasons. So we came up with the idea, of course, to start a Facebook page. So we have Napa SOS as a group of parents, and it's really just a way to disseminate the information that's talked about here. It's to look at information for meetings like this for parents that can't make it on their schedule. What I did, and I understand that there have been some changes to the data that was used as opposed to what was originally presented during the small school closure meeting. I had taken the liberty to look through the demographic report that was completed in March and compile that information into a series of graphs about enrollment and historical trends in enrollment. And while I don't disagree with the fact that enrollment is declining, I think there are definitely some discrepancies considering how much that is. Kind of like the idea we're roughly the same number of kids we were 10 years ago. So we've kind of done this, but we're not actually very far below that at the current moment. There's also some situations with also River School coming back into the district, and the potential for NVLA to come back into the district. And I know me and a lot of other parents, when we talk about trying to delay this decision, it would be really nice to find out what is happening officially with NVLA before any decision is made on closing a school. But anyway, I did bring copies of these that I would like to distribute if you guys would be so kind as to take a look at them. I'm sure that some of the specific numbers might change. I'm looking forward to reviewing the data. It would be really nice to have those before meetings so we can avoid making errors. There might not be enough for everybody. I'm sorry, my printer was running out of ink. But also, just for parents out in the audience, I have a ton of these flyers. If you are having problems getting information out to your schools about when these meetings are, who you can contact for questions, this is all available. I have a bunch of copies. Take them back to your school site. You can also find us online and get all the information there too. We really just want to foster all the involvement of as many parents as we can in this community, because it's not just about our kids, it's about every kid, and every kid deserves to have the best education possible.
All right, thank you. All right, our next speaker is Mallory Macedo. Good. And she'll be talking about Mount George.
Thank you for your time. Know some of you on the board and the 7-Eleven committee. Thank you for your volunteerism. So I'm going to talk generally about the small schools and specifically Mount George. I have 2 children at Mount George currently in 5th grade and in 1st grade, and then a toddler at home that, as is mentioned earlier, I hope that she can go there as well. At the last board meeting, I spoke to the board about the importance of Mount George to our family and the small school nature, that my son had been at another school in the district, we don't need to name names, and wasn't as successful there, so we retained him and did a bonus year of kindergarten, and we retained him to Mount George for the small school status. And since then, he is now in 5th grade and thriving. And he's done amazingly throughout the years. And I can see all those IB principles that were just talked about caring and risk taker and all of those things budding from him. And he's an amazing little human being. And so he just actually had surgery last week. He did a tonsillectomy, and his anesthesiologist was in the Queen. And he's like, well, what's going on with you right now? And I said, well, we're talking about Mount George. He's like, all 6 of my kids graduated from Mount George, and they're now all in their 30s. 3 of them are doctors. So to hear that in our community as we're talking about it, this is a tight-knit community. Every single one of the children that belong to a parent behind me and on this board matter. And so I'm not going to stand up here and say that Mount George is the only one that matters, but what I am going to say is that small schools matter, tight-knit communities matter, people that care about our kids matter, and to see that every single day where we are is important to us and our family. And so one of the things that I was reading about in the district demographic study and the facility capacity analysis is that it actually identified the importance of choice and special programs within the district. Mount George was my family's choice, and it will continue to be my choice through my 2-year-old daughter's 5th grade year, as long as the board will allow that for me and my family. And then the other piece that I want to say is that research continues to show that small schools have higher student achievement, closer knit communities, higher parent involvement, higher attendance, higher teacher satisfaction, and fewer behavioral problems. I too would be curious to see what the college graduation rate is out of these four schools going through, because those communities foster the most positive environment and positive education for our kids. So I urge you to keep Mount George open. I urge you to think about other opportunities or other options fiscally other than closing the schools that mean so much to us in this room. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next speaker is Peter Bartlett, and he'll be speaking about small school closures and the 7-Eleven process.
Good evening. I'll be very brief because some of the topics I intended to talk about have been touched upon already, so
thank you.
Give you back some of your time. My name is Peter Bartlett. I have a 5th grader and a 3rd grader at Mount George. I just want to express the hope that the committee is given enough time and latitude and information to fully evaluate the decision they have to make, and that they are explicitly considering as an alternative delaying for at least a year closing any schools. I hope that there's room to consider that. I also wanted to just make the observation with respect to Napa Valley Language Academy, which has approximately 670 students at ballpark $10,000 in ADA per student. That's $6.7 million. That's roughly 4% of the annual budget, if I recall correctly from the slides. So I know there's a lot of information that you've had to produce, and it takes a long time to produce, but you've also put this committee on a very, very short time span. So it's a huge challenge, and I hope they'll be given enough time and all the information they need to make an informed decision. Thank you.
All right, next speaker is Kim DeSagas. Hopefully that's close enough.
Hi, I'm Kim DeSias, and I'm a parent of 2 kids at Mount George. I have a 3rd grader and a 1st grader there. I just wanted to say thank you for all of your time and effort on this matter. I know everybody sincerely appreciates all the hard work that you guys are going to have to do over the next couple of months, and I just wanted to say thank you. I think we as a community hope that the closure of any of the small schools will not be performed, obviously, but that we could delay the possible closure until other avenues are explored. We've been told that closing the 2 small schools will save approximately $1 million. I think it's important to note that $1 million in savings is only 0.6% of the entire district budget of $162 million, which is projected for 2020 to 2021. And the actual amount that's saved may be much less than is anticipated. You know, when you close these small schools, you limit school choice for parents, and it might cause parents to leave the district for private or charter schools, like has been mentioned before, decreasing the ADA. You know, I think some of these schools are like the top performing schools in our district, which I don't think that's been explicitly mentioned, but the ratings of some of these schools are very high. And I'd love the committee to be provided with that data of like what the test scores are at these schools and like what the ratings are at these schools, because that's the first thing that parents look at when they're thinking about, you know, like where to bring their kids to school and what school to enroll their kids in. So I think that really needs to be considered strongly. Also, you know, there's data to support that in other cities around the country where school closures have been performed, some of the districts end up saving much less than what was expected. And in some cases, students pulling out of the district to attend private schools has offset any savings at all. So I think that's something to consider, is that, you know, it was put into the budget that closing these 2 schools is definitely going to save this much money. But when you look at data from around the country, that's not always the case, and sometimes nothing is saved. So I think that's something the committee needs to consider and maybe look into as well, some of that data, you know, and I can help provide that too at future meetings, but I think that's really important. You know, and again, school closures should be a last resort. So in the California Department of Education, they have a closing a school best practices guide. It specifically states the decision to close a school must be based upon hard empirical evidence that leads to a broadly supported, incontrovertible conclusion that this district cannot afford to keep a particular school open without cuts elsewhere. And it also states that a 7-Eleven committee should consider alternatives to closing schools before recommending closing any schools. So I think, you know, that's really important that this committee hopefully will look into alternatives to closing these schools, because obviously the budget deficit is huge and we're really not going to save that much money closing the schools, it doesn't seem like, and maybe not any at all, who knows. So comprehensive, you know, cost benefit analysis should be performed, and I think other options need to be explored. So anyway, thank you all for your time. Thank
you. Sabrina Wolfson.
Good evening. My name is Sabrina Wolfson, and I'm a Mount George parent. Thank you all for your service and your time for this very important decision. that's before you, that you will be making a recommendation to the board. We've heard a lot tonight about declining enrollment, and I think, that is obviously a reality, but it's important to point out that Mount George is not contributing to that trend. I'm handing out a graph to all of you that shows what Mount George's enrollment has been over time, and it has consistently been at around between 250 and 260 over time. And last year was an anomaly, despite a lot of demand. There was 52 children that open enrolled to Mount George, 36 of which had Mount George as their first choice. But for some reason, we ended up with 2 kindergarten classes, one with 14 and one with 15. And I had open enrolled my child. We were 12th on the wait list. We moved 1 spot during open enrollment to number 11. I was told we were going to go to our neighborhood school. And 2 days before school started, I got a call from the district saying, "Oh, we had a scheduling snafu, and we have a spot for you." And so I was, of course, delighted, because that was where we wanted to go, and we accepted the position. And then when we showed up to school, I was really shocked to see that despite this long wait list of 52 kids and lots of friends who had ended up were told, "You're not going to get in, you have to go accept your other choices," that it was drastically under-enrolled. And so now that's put us in this trajectory of a downward trajectory, because now we can't recover. We could have had capacity for 52 kids, and we only got 29. So we were under-enrolled by 23, and obviously that under-enrollment is going to continue over the next 4 years. And then couple that with the announcement of the potential school closure. We had 47 kids that were enrolled this year. We had full enrollment in both the classes, and about 9 or 10 kids dropped out for fear of that the school would be closing. Chair Franco raised the issue about, okay, well, where are kids in the district going? Because there are such high rates of out-migration from a lot of the schools. Well, they're going to small schools like Mount George and like Yountville and like West Park and like Alta Heights, because they should be considered a special program. Not every kid thrives in a large school, which is one of the reasons why I chose Mount George. And also, the capacity study that everybody's referenced talked about the importance of school choice and the fact that the district's able to retain more students by offering more special programs. Well, if you close Mount George, you're eliminating the IB program, which is a big draw for students that come to Mount George. And it's an established program, and the district has, as one of its strategic goals, is to implement inquiry-based learning across the district. Well, Mount George is already doing that, and is doing it really well, and it's drawing kids from across the district to attend there. I'll also add that, we talked about that funding is ADA based, and so average daily attendance is really important, and Mount George has the lowest rate of chronic absenteeism at 2.7%, and the district's rate is 10%, and most of the schools fall within the 10% absenteeism rate. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Vanessa Struven.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Struven, and I want to thank you for being here today, taking the time out of your day to be here. I just wanted to address, I know you're looking at the redevelopment in Napa, but there's a lot of affordable housing that's coming to Napa. One of the units or apartments is the Stoddard West. It's right behind Home Depot, and I just wanted to, it's showing that it's like a sheer school, but it's closer to some of the Mount George and Alta Heights schools. So I wanted to make sure that the new low-income housing is being looked at. There's the Manzetta housing, which is a satellite affording housing, and that's going at 2951 Sosco Avenue, and that could be, if the zones are changed, we could get more kids from those housing. There's the Redwood Road Burbank apartments that are going in. Where those kids are going to go? Are they going to go to West Park? Because that's like a West Park neighborhood. And then there's other apartments going on Coombsville Road, Napa Courthouse Apartments, and they're at 535 Coombsville Road, and that's like a Mount George area and Alta Heights. So I'm just I want the low-income housing, the affordable housing, to be looked into the redevelopment if we're going to get more kids coming to our school. were these kids that moved out to the outside areas and they're moving back to Napa. I just want these housing to be considered so that we can maybe get our population up at the smaller schools and make our schools better. I just wanted to address that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. The last speaker of the evening, speaker is Bella Ramos.
Good evening, and thank you to the 7-Eleven committee, and my apologies to district staff. You will see me today and also again on Thursday as my district. I'm the county supervisor for the 5th district, is the district that is actually bearing a lot of the burdens of the school district financial crisis that we are in. My district encompasses Mount George, Alta Heights, and all of American Canyon. So certainly at many different stages, this affects all of my constituents and our community as a whole. First, as a matter of housekeeping, as we were here, there was data present up on the screens, and it was stated that it would be put on the website. I would ask, if you have it available to put up on the screens, put it on the website. I could have been following along on my phone or on my iPad, and that would certainly help me formulate my questions, and I think also for many members of the audience. My next one is a question, and it may sound rhetorical, but I don't at all mean it to be that way, and that is, have you addressed what the cost is associated with each displaced student in creating not just the greater facility capacity, and I know that Mr. Pearson went through some of that, but the actual cost associated. Once we have impacted schools, we know that behavior becomes quite a difficult thing to handle in larger class sizes, especially at elementary level. Have you looked at how many more aides we're going to need? Have you looked at the programming and the spatial structure that's going to be required at those elementary campuses, especially to take on these displaced students? So I think that's a very different factor from what we have seen today of what the closure savings would be. The next one I would say is no one has come to us and asked us what we've got on the line. Napa Pipe just moved dirt this week. It was a very exciting moment for the city and for the county. We need to have a really hard and fast sit down here of what's at stake. We have our regional housing numbers allocation coming from the Association of Bay Area Governments, of which I am the representative. That number is going to be huge. It's going to hit us hard in March, and with changes in housing policy, we're going to have to make a lot more changes here in terms of how much housing we provide. The next thing I would say to you is you have forgotten to include one big factor here. You're looking at numbers, but you haven't looked at culture. Small schools allow for greater student achievement, allow for an intimate learning environment, allow for greater participation, not just by the students, but by the parents. It's evidenced here. We need to look at culture as part of the equation. You can't put a number on that, but you should really put value to that.
I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, particularly the people on the 7-Eleven committee that we will go through this together, and I feel really confident that we'll be able to provide the board with a report that captures all that we'll be learning over the next series of meetings. I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming. We will convene again on September 3rd from 5:30 to 7:30 here in this room, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much. Good evening. Oh, baby. Wow.